Part of that is good, part of that is not good as well.
Yes. Good and bad both. Good is that we are able to get a lot of people from different parts of the world. Our 2 days conference had more than 20 participants from different parts, Brazil, US, UK. So it's kind of global event in that sense.
Yeah, I've seen.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so sorry. My net is acting up in the last minute.
No issues, Bindya.
Bindya, yes, it is Bindya.
So, this is Bindya Paka.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are
Yes.
audible, Bindya.
Should we start, Bindya?
I cannot hear anybody.
Okay, I think her internet is giving a little bit of a problem. So just to introduce, this is Bindya Paka. She is the associate coordinator to this panel. Bindya, are you able to hear us?
I cannot hear anybody. Am I audible? I don't know if I'm audible, but I'm not able to hear anybody.
Give a message, Bindya, you are audible.
Yeah, I'll just write.
You are audible.
Maybe ask her to log out once and log in again.
Yes.
Sometimes that works.
We'll just wait for 2 minutes for Bindya to rejoin and then we can begin the session.
Sure. Hello, Bindya. Are we audible now?
Bindya, you're muted.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. Okay, good. A very good morning to everybody. So for the past 2 days, we've had several interesting panels over a range of themes and ideas. Today, we start the third day of the 9th Creative Theory Colloquium 2022, organized by the Creative Theory Association in collaboration with the International Herbert Marcuse Society, the Raza Foundation, and the India International Center, with a very interesting panel on the future of public health. So I invite the coordinator for the session, Priyanka Yadav, who is a research scholar at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to introduce our distinguished panelists for the day, along with a briefing to the theme of the session.
Thank you, Bindya. Thank you so much. So yes, I welcome you all for this 9th Creative Theory Colloquium and to this wonderful panel, which is known as the Future of Public Health. When we talk about future, health is something that that is thought of very immediately or by default, especially when we as a community and humanity at large have suffered because of the global pandemic. Having said that, it becomes all the more important to discuss future possibilities of public health in an organized, sensitive, and a critical manner. Therefore, we bring forward our esteemed panel whose insight in this domain can bring rational thinking and inform us about the various progress or perhaps the kind of things which can help uplift the public health sector in future. So I welcome the chair first. So our chair for today's session is Mr. Chandrakant Leheria. He is a leading medical doctor, infectious diseases and preventive medicine specialist, child health and vaccine expert. He has worked with WHO and he publishes regularly in medical journals. Our first speaker for today's session is Dr. Priya. She's a professor at the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, School of Social Sciences, JNU. She has also worked as an advisor at the National Health System Resource Center. Her area of interest and specialization include nutrition and health, urban planning and health, public policy formulation and analysis. Our second speaker for this session is Dr. Vikas Bhajpai, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Social Medicine and Community Health, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Previously, he worked as a public health physician in Delhi. He has experience in working with trade unions, youth, and women organizations on health issues of the underprivileged. I welcome all three of you. And now I hand over the baton to the chair to give his introductory remark. And after that, we begin the session. Just to note down, we are giving 20 minutes each to the speaker to speak. And we would like to request to stick to the timeline. So thank you so much. And Mr. Leheria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priyanka ji, and good morning. Good morning, esteemed panelists, colleagues who have joined here. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and discuss with such an eminent panel about the future of public health. I've received an agenda or program flow, so to say, so I'll speak for a few minutes and then I'll invite the panelists who will speak, who are requested to speak for 20 minutes each. And then that will leave some time for discussion and we will have a follow-up discussion, more of a dialogue style, and then we will close by 11 a.m. So that's the plan. I'm aware that my fellow panelists have a much more to share, but let me set the background for the future of public health this session. And what could be the critical reflections? So one of the things which I recall, and the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, he won Nobel Prize in 2015 for economics. In his book, The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and Origin of Inequality, has reflected about health. And one of the discourse he has in his book, he says that much of the development, which include economic as well as social development in some of the high-income countries, happened in the last 2 centuries, attributable to what they did and how they followed up after the previous 2 pandemics. So Angus Deaton writes in that book that after cholera pandemic, which started in 1817, there were 7 cholera pandemics over last 150 years, but 1817 onward, the cholera pandemic, first 2 pandemics, 1817 onward, and then 1830, 1840s resulted in the great sanitary movement, the International Sanitary Conference, all this thing. So he argued, and that is a fact, that that cholera pandemic resulted in the development or progress of public health across the world. So that was one major development, and which today we are talking about public health, but much of the public health movement started in mid of the 19th century after cholera pandemic. Of course, the plague pandemics and of 14th century onward, there was a lot of attention on public health, but not that kind of global coordinated attention. So that was one aspect. Second, Angus Deaton argued that after flu pandemic, the similar developments happened, but much of the development was focused on medical care, treatment, antibiotics, and others. So medical advancement happened. Argument, because in the modern society, the argument always centered around economic development rather than social, or social developments come, but they come at the later stage. So economic. So Angus Deaton argued as an economist that much of the development, what we see in economic development growth, which we see in Europe, happened after the 2 pandemics and what countries did. And now the countries which are high income countries or upper middle income countries, they followed strengthening public health, improving health services, investment in the health services in those nations, also providing free cares or the models of the care. And that's how much of the economy grew, and attributed the growth of those countries attributable in a sense to the pandemics of the past. Now we are in the 21st century, 2.5 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, what would be the key actions which would be taken by different nations after this pandemic? That's difficult to predict. But what we know that even with the previous two pandemics, the low and middle income countries did not pay sufficient attention, did not follow through with the sufficient attention to improve health in those nations. So it is not given that pandemic automatically results in improved increased investment by the governments on health. But I want to bring another dimension, and that is between there are few studies which have emerged, and now we know that in addition to the pandemic is not the only challenge. We know that emerging and re-emerging diseases are going to be another challenge. And we also know the Wellcome Trust has studied and other group have studied that between 1940 and year 2004, around 350 pathogens or the viruses and bacteria, different pathogens had emerged, which are able to cause disease in human beings. Out of those 350 pathogens, around 2/3 of those pathogens emerge from the forests or animals to the human being, the zoonotic in origin. So that is going to be another challenge. Third dimension, we have seen in the past, and we have seen in this COVID-19 pandemic, the inequality. Though the medical advancement or public health movements have happened, but they have widened inequity. The majority of access to the therapies, interventions, and health services in high-income countries. The low and middle-income countries rarely have that kind of access, and this is not this inequality is not reducing but widening. We have seen this in the access to vaccine, COVID-19 vaccines and therapies, and with monkeypox also, that this is not altering or changing. So keeping all these things in mind, that pandemics bring change, but it is not automatic. Countries need to act upon it. Zoonotic diseases are emerging. The studies which I said that 200 or 2/3 of the diseases are zoonotic a very recent study published in Nature on 28th of April have said that if a global temperature increase between now till 2070 between 1 degree Celsius, it may result in at least 15,000 additional pathogens emerging in the human population, and some of them can cause disease. That study say that those pathogens would mostly emerge in Asia and Africa, which essentially means the risk of new diseases, the new challenges is more common for Asia and Africa, where the health services are weak, which always face the excess in the various intervention which should be made available to tackle such challenges. I would summarize my point and then hand over to my colleagues with this background. What we know that pandemics bring changes, but they do not bring positive changes in the settings where they should be brought. Pandemics, every passing day, we are reaching closer to the next epidemic, outbreaks and pandemic because of the deforestation, climate change, urbanization, rapid transport, antimicrobial resistance, single animal battery farming, our preference for a wild animal meat. So there are many factors which are resulting in ensuring that next day or today we are closer to the next epidemic outbreak than yesterday. And inequality, nothing systematically being done. And final point is that though in the last 2.5 years, we heard a lot about public health or strengthening public health, but if we reflect now, the discussion or discourse on public strengthening health system or public health was very superficial, without sufficient understanding, and even that is being forgotten at the level of government. It is the right time to discuss future of public health. And with this, I would like to invite the panelists for this session. And let me check. As per my list, the first panelist whom I would like to invite is Dr. Priya. Priyanka has already introduced Dr. Priya, and so she does not need any introduction. So over to you, Dr. Priya.
Thank you, Dr. Chandkant, and thank you for laying out the broad scenario of what are the challenges to the public health that we are facing now at this time, because that is what we would intend to address. What I will do is take that as a given which you have already presented and talk about in the 20 minutes that I have, about how public health as a discipline needs to introspect and think about where it needs to go forward in the way we think about public health and about what we do. So I just titled this talk, The Future of Public Health Between Authoritarian Tendencies and Liberative Potential. As you referred to the industrial towns of Europe, and that being the origin of the present institutionalized form of public health that we have, we clearly have this historical legacy. And we'll have to go back to that and to understand that to take us forward. That's my understanding of any knowledge processes. And I think public health will have to go back to that. But what we face right now are both external and internal crises. And I will attempt to place how I diagnose this present crisis. The historical legacy that we have since public health's institutionalized development in the 19th century clearly states these two: the authoritarian tendencies which we see in the way the European towns started with something called the health police, which was meant to ensure that there was hygienic behavior of the migrant working class that came into the industrial towns of that time. So that was one element in public health. And the other was the issue of John Snow showing us how the environmental conditions are important and therefore led to urban infrastructure and public health being developed. And the third stream was of something like Angels telling us about conditions of the working class at that time, and thereby leading to labor rights, labor laws, and improving the conditions of work of the workers. So these are three dimensions of public health, all of which is evident right through our history. And what we need to see is what kind of academic work contributed to which of the streams, and therefore how do we in today's time contribute to the liberative potential that public health clearly has. So I will briefly attempt to do that. I'm very hesitant in an audience of social scientists trying to place views of this nature, but let me still go ahead and place looking for feedback and inputs to take this kind of a discussion forward. I place these three streams before you. The authoritarian, the environmental, and the, let's say, the bottom-up conditions of life approach, or the social determinants approach. And what we see in all three frames of that time and over the 2 centuries that we have, the 19th and 20th, are centralized systems with universal solutions. A colonial dichotomy in their practice. While we had the sanitary movement in the colonizer countries, the others certainly got the brunt of it. And therefore, the practice of public health has these dichotomies as much as a centralized perspective. And I would place the centralized perspective and knowledge frame as part of the reason for the dichotomization. Post-independence, the welfare states in the ex-colonized countries developed their health systems, but they tended to emulate those of the first world or their colonizers and dichotomize them from the popular everyday practice in their own countries and any other epistemological traditions that existed in their own countries. This continues, this dichotomy between the state provisioning and its legitimization of what therefore becomes the formal system whether of modern science or of other traditions of health sciences and health knowledge. Studies conducted, for example, in Delhi in 2014-15 show that the formal services deal only with about 33% of illnesses in Delhi in 2014-15 across various sections and classes. So this is what we have seen as the development of public health. The roots of the knowledge paradigm is clearly in the positivist biomedicine and demography. But subsequently, there has been a major progressive movement with social sciences and the realist paradigm being introduced at various points of time. And all those points of time have been points of larger societal crises. Whether it was in the industrial towns of Europe in the 19th century, where it could not be just pure biomedical. There wasn't enough knowledge of biomedicine, but also there was an eco-social kind of approach. What we call eco-social today was evident in the way studies were done at that point of time. But as now very consciously we bring in the realist paradigm and the contextual needs, we do so in the post-independence. We do that in 1970s when there is upheaval across the world. We do that when the HIV pandemic comes. Now in the 21st century with escalating inequalities in access to services and technologies and unaffordable medical bills, even for the first world, highlighted by the 2008 recession, the knowledge base includes these interdisciplinarity and social sciences and realist approaches. And yet we seem to keep harking back to the positivist. And we have the knowledge base supporting the authoritarian tendencies today in terms of the continuity of reductionist approaches, which attempt to modernize themselves at this point of time. And so, for example, you have the World Bank epidemiologists and economists creating a database using something, statistical tool that they devise called the disability adjusted life years. And that becomes the basis for quantifying ill health and disease across the world, including in India. And it is used for prioritization of funds. And there's enough analysis to show how it skews the priorities. Now in the 21st century, there are three threats that I'd like to highlight. There is the external threat from a highly medicalized vision of healthcare. And so when we have a slogan like universal healthcare for the SDGs or for health development at large put out by WHO and UNICEF, it is about universal health coverage with medical care funded by insurance. Thereby, public health gets relegated very much to the background. Second is the heightening of authoritarian tendencies in keeping with political and economic ethos of the time. And there, public health gets called upon, as in COVID, positing options of lockdown as against well-being and economics. So it becomes public health versus well-being and economic development, rather than the three being seen as conjoined and together. And the third is a process of reconfiguring of the identity of the field itself, which is coming from internal to the field or internal to the academic sphere. From public health, we are tending to use more and more the term global health, with some discourse incorporated of decolonization of knowledge, which, if you look at the journals and do a review of the authors as well as the titles, you'll find global health replacing public health perspectives and an attempt at decolonization by bringing in researchers from the LMICs. But in most of the discourse, those who get published are the ones who are not questioning the content, the ontology, and the episteme of the positivist roots of the discipline or questioning biomedicine. That's the dominant mainstream of public health. We see that also in, for example, the way policymakers pick up the more easy technocratic solutions. And what is recognized by the high polloi of the world today, where the Nobel Prize given to development economists like Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo are for something which they do call the randomized controlled trials for health, including for health programs. And so that is what is recognized as legitimate evidence for public health policy and programs, and not the social determinants of health, the issues of eco-social dimensions, of embodiment of social location, and of issues of economics, livelihood, culture, of different epistemologies coming into the mainstream of what is health systems research, while the contingencies of demand and of local politics on the ground does make WHO and national governments take cognizance of and also promote the development of other epistemological traditions like traditional medicine. But the two don't talk to each other. Health systems, development and research, and the traditional medicine streams within WHO as well remain wide apart. And we see that in the entire public health discourse, where there is, if anything, a mocking of the other epistemologies as we saw during COVID, rather than attempting to incorporate, even while we talk of realist approaches and diversity of perspectives being important. So this kind of framing we see in epidemiology and in health systems research, while at the same time, we do have strands which are attempting to take these into account, and I'll talk about them briefly later. Now, in this kind of a context, what the global means here is, and moving to global health, why I call it seemingly regressive to the liberative potential, is because it is even more centralizing. It is tending to blur the contextual differences between the high-income countries and the LMICs in terms of health problems and health priorities, because it is doing a global analysis and creating global priorities. And its tools like the tallies that I referred to blur all this in the name of equity and an inclusiveness of all at the same level, putting everything on one platform. What I would now like to move to, with this kind of a political economy of the crisis and a politics of knowledge of the crisis. How can we, as an academic stream, where we are talking of future of thinking, contribute to the liberative potential? And our contribution, I would see, would have to be through a transformation of the knowledge framings, especially for health systems research, policy planning, and implementation. That's where we see the impact of the kind of academics we do. The two broad approaches that I just mentioned, one, the biomedical disease and technological intervention focused approach, which claims universal applicability, and the other, a more ecological, socially oriented, and contextually rooted approach, are with us today. There has been a great advancement in the ecological, socially oriented, and contextually rooted approach. And yet, every time policymakers have to take decisions, and especially in times of crisis, the justification immediately becomes, we have to fall back on science. And the notion of science still continues to be the same reductionist, technocentric, and with solutions that can be applied at a technocratic level. So how do we move out of this notion of science which underlies how public health gets addressed is, to me, one way in which we can contribute to moving towards a more liberative potential, even in these times. Because the crises that face those in power do have their own contingencies, and they have to, at some point, as history shows us, take up solutions which may be outside the immediate technocratic and outside their managerial ken, and give them some space. So can we start making those spaces? But first, I think we need to do a bit of introspection on how public health professionals themselves are thinking about public health, even among those who are placing themselves, locating themselves with the liberative potential of public health, as it naturally contributes to the needs of the more marginalized, because they are the ones with the greater health problems. In doing this, there has the fragmentation within that I spoke of. The fact that today epidemiology and its more cutting edge policy oriented epidemiology is being done by mathematicians and statisticians in departments of mathematics and statistics who have little grounding in public health. Example of that is what we saw again during COVID, the Imperial College giving us the graph which shows us that only if you close down social and economic activity and thereby the lockdown comes, that you will prevent deaths and so on, is where we have allowed ourselves to go when we allow public health to specialize in such ways that we have epidemiology as becoming a separate field, HSR as a separate field, health education as a third field, rather than an integrated public health perspective, which is what we, even the likes of me, have been taught to practice. And it's in the last few decades that this dichotomization of and fragmentation of the discipline has become very evident. It's also because we have so many disciplines. It is by definition a synthesizing science, and we draw from many disciplines, and therefore a kind of fragmentation is there in the intellectual content. I've just looked at my clock and I think I will need to close very soon. So I'm going to now move to saying that what I'm suggesting in this whole sphere of fragmentation, which allows for the more reductionist technocratic approaches to take over, we provide them that possibility. If we move to what many other disciplines like the sustainability sciences and science and technology studies are doing much more than we are in the sphere of public health, is to move to much more holistic approaches. And I'm not talking about the holism only of the traditional sciences, which is where medicine tends to see holism, but look at something called critical holism. Holism, which brings in a contextualized, multi-level, multi-dimensional approach and the multi-dimensional conceptualization of health and its causality. Thereby, this is the ontological approach, realist and historical analyses being the epistemological approach that one would have to take for critical holism, but tending to go beyond the realist, because as we see in reviews of realist use in public health, the historical analyses, epidemiological base, the diversity of context of the whole, and pluralist epistemologies are all missing even in the mainstream realist studies and stream of public health. And therefore, we need to posit some kind of a larger unifying theoretical framing, which will be able to provide a space where all these various streams can talk to each other and have a common framing, which is not to say we don't need these specializations. We do, and it does provide benefits. But can they talk to each other? Can they dialogue to each other, with each other, and thereby give us more comprehensive understandings of the problem as well as of the possible solutions? This would require going beyond the positivist to allow for contextualized and diverse approaches. Interdisciplinarity move to transdisciplinarity, which means incorporating not only different disciplines, academic disciplines, but incorporating non-academics in the research team with their specific epistemological frames. This requires recognizing the validity of layperson understandings and their diversity, recognizing the validity of other knowledge traditions, and an intellectual ethos that encourages dialogue across all these grids. Now, at this point of time, this may be asking for too much, but certainly I would posit that those who are looking for liberative potential in public health need to make this attempt at a leap forward. It's a leap which needs to be made for us to be able to think from a bottom-up perspective. And we have a lot of support for that in the current developments in the knowledge sphere, complexity theory certainly being one, but there is a whole range that exists. Yes, Priyanka? I need to wind up?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I will. Just give me 2 minutes.
Yes.
Is that okay? Yeah. So I'm positing this as a unifying theory, and one can see how, if one looks at, for example, the primary healthcare document of Alma-Ata, which is what we keep going back to, and the world did in 2018 in the Astana Declaration as well, it also asks for more inputs for us to think of something like a primary healthcare 2.0 for the 21st century. There are other sources for something called critical holism in the way we can think about public health, but I'll stop here and take questions, and maybe there's other readings that we.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ritupriya. So a lot of reflections. I would not try to summarize those, but one of the key points which I would say is core. There are many points. It's challenging to summarize. So I would say that one of the points which you highlighted about integrated public health and the reflections on public health, economic well-being, and growth and development being seen as a conjoint rather than in isolation are some of the challenges which you have highlighted. You reflected about global health. We will take questions and a discussion on this topic after the second talk. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Vikas Bhajpai to share his reflections in next 20 minutes. And then we will have a discussion, and then we'll open this for a question by the other participants and audience.
Thank you, Dr. Leheria, for giving this opportunity, and thanks to other organizers who have afforded this opportunity to share some of the views. I was also not very sure to begin with as to what aspects need I discuss here, given the kind of audience which we will have. But I think going by the concept note of the colloquium that I got, I'd like to focus on certain things which I think are a priority. To begin with, what is the future of public health? I mean, it's like saying, also asking, what is the future of mankind? And people of my want or my kind of background, we feel obligated always to believe and say that the future is bright, only that it faces a lot many challenges, and the need, therefore, of our being able to negotiate those challenges successfully. So Now, the thing is, what all impacts on public health? Well, I teach to my students, public health is everything under the sun impacts public health, including the sun itself. Okay. So, but unfortunately, insofar as the dominant paradigm in public health policy or the is that of missing the woods for the trees, and increasingly, what I find is that even the trees that we cite, we are more interested in chopping them down rather than nurturing those trees. Given the overall policy paradigm as it has come to exist, not just in India, but across the globe, and is being enforced with in many crude ways. But the good thing is that while they do so, resistance is also on for all of this. Now, there are the question is of how do we identify the challenges, okay, and then how do we fight those challenges. So I will not go into the entire breadth of these aspects, but still bring out certain points or certain things for aspects for consideration by the learned audience here. And see, I think when we talk of challenges, we must bear in mind that the society builds its institutions in its own image. Okay, may it be health institutions, may it be educational institutions, or institutions of economics and various other kinds. So what is the reality of our society? See, this reality of our society is, it is a class divided, caste divided society, where fault lines also exist along the lines of religion and ethnicity and regions and all those kind of things. And given the situation as it is, I mean, it is not that we are making attempts to remove these fault lines, to bridge them, to heal them, but rather the politics and economy and social orientation of the system, it seems to feed on these fault lines, and it seeks to broaden them, deepen them, to privilege the power structures and the powers that be. So if that is the situation, then it becomes given that our health system also reflects these inequities, these inequalities, these divisions as they are. Unfortunately, what happens is that we do acknowledge the inequities and divisions and the discriminatory nature of health services and all. But we do so in very mechanistic way, that okay, this is a problem, so now what is the policy patch that we can put on it to take care of the problem, without really tracing the social political origins of these deficiencies, which are part and parcel of our health systems. Okay, so you would have a policy of public-private partnerships, okay, to make health more accessible and reachable to the marginalized. We then have now this state-funded health insurance schemes, and all these things are brought into play. But then we find that by experience that this is not quite yielded the kind of solutions that we need. Now, when I said this malady of a problem of not being able to see the social, political, economic roots of the divisions that are interladen in our health systems, in our health services systems. This phenomenon, it plays out at different levels. It plays out at the level of policy and the government and institutions. It plays out at the level of individual institutions that constitute health services system or health system. And then it plays out at the level of the people who work in these systems, okay, their own orientation towards the people whom they are supposed to serve. And lastly, it plays out at the level of the societies. Now, the thing is, if we identify these, the problems at these 3 or 4 levels, then the prospects of correcting these have to be studied at all these levels. And what is the situation as to that? Now, insofar as health policy paradigm is concerned, I will not go very far, but let us begin from 47 onwards. Okay. Now, in 46, we had this report by Sir Joseph Bohr, which we popularly known as Bohr Committee report, which actually laid down the foundation for the development of health services system or health system in India, not just health services system, health system. And when I say health services, health system, it implies that health was seen as part and parcel of the way economy was to be structured, the way industry was to develop, the way agriculture was to develop, and various other parameters or which impact on health. So Bohr Committee laid out a very elaborate plan, and in which they consciously asserted that even though we've been tasked to only lay out a plan of a scheme for the development of health of the people, but I think, but we think we will be, we will not be fulfilling our task if we were not to make broad recommendations about economy, about agriculture, about industry, about various other aspects which are essential to making of health of the people. And that is one report which in in traditional or not traditional, what shall I say, for want of better word, a holistic conceptualization, people who believe in holistic conceptualization of public health, they still like to go back to that report and talk about it and the way it prescribed. But then that report had come in the background of certain developments which were taking place at that time in the world. And what were the developments? The developments were that after World War II, Soviet Union had emerged as a superpower. That is the first socialist state where working class was in power, was now in contention at the level of the world politics, world arena, and lot many other countries also became socialist. Even in the Western countries, there was a powerful and a vigorous movement of the working classes. In Britain itself, Labour Party had come to power, and the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee, he he took floor in the parliament, and from the floor of the parliament he declared, ours is going to be a socialist government. You know, these were his words, a far cry from what Labour is today in Britain. But then, and there was a whole set of policy paradigm about public health, housing, about removing illiteracy, you know, about joblessness. And in that policy framework, health was a part of it, you know. So somehow these developments, they recognized the interminable link between health and all the other aspects, which go into creating conditions for wholesome development of humans, you know, of human life itself, imparting dignity to it. Unfortunately, in India, while we did have a political independence of sorts, but certainly that had failed to change the way Indian society was constructed. We had a very modernist constitution overlaid upon a social firmament, which was quite feudal in its orientation. Okay, not feudal in the classical sense of the Middle Ages and all, but still its orientations. You know, we retained our caste system, and have, even after 75 years, we now, even those in power, they talk of its virtues rather than talking of removing it or working towards obliteration of caste. So we had this situation, and hence the class interests which were at play in the society at large, they were bound to impact on the way we developed our health services system, also our health system as such. Likewise, all other systems, but since we are on the topic of health, I'll concentrate on health. See, Bhore Committee said that 15% of all government expenditure should be on health. And in the very first 5-year plan, all that we managed to allocate was about 5% to health. Okay. And in subsequent plans, it came down even lower than that. So that has been the trajectory. But then, given the way international scene was, it was a time of Cold War, and there was a socialist camp and all. There was also this fact that at the time when we gained independence, India's own big capitalists, they hardly had the financial muscle to be able to build the kind of health institutions, tertiary care hospitals, medical colleges and all, which were very much required, because for them to be able to have healthy workers, healthy working people to work in the industry and all. So likewise, now it was requested to the government to build all this infrastructure. And hence, we find that the emphasis which came was not in terms of reaching out healthcare expeditiously to meet the immense health problems which were there at the level of the people, that is by strengthening the sub-centers or primary health centers or those peripheral healthcare institutions. The emphasis to begin with was on building big hospitals, medical college hospitals and all. Okay. Anyways, going into all of that history will take very long. So I to the present phase of neoliberalism. I don't even go into the entire history of what neoliberalism did to health culture and health sector in India. But without having to add my own words, the National Health Policy 2017, you should read its draft version which came. You know, when neoliberalism neoliberal policies were openly acclaimed and were peddled to the people at large as the that they will provide succor and they will develop us and all that. The push towards corporate hospitals and big private sector, it was not just supported by the state, Apollo being the example. There are hundreds and thousands of others where public resources were made available to these private players and all. But it was said that this will bring world-class healthcare to the people here in India on their doorsteps, and arrangements like providing free care to the poor and all those kind of things were made. 2017 policy in its draft version, it stated that all this private sector, they should be exempt from the encumbrance of taking care of the poor. Okay, because they are contributing to the growth of the national economy by their contribution to the GDP. And they do an active advocacy for by the contribution to GDP through medical tourism. Okay. So, keeping in mind the country that we are, where government's own policy establishment, Vivek Debroy, in a recent paper said only barely 10% of Indians earn rupees 25,000 or more per month. Okay. Given those realities, here we have a government, and mind you, this is not just BJP government. The policy, National Health Policy 2017 had been in the making since the time of the UPA government. Its draft version was much the creation of the UPA government. So we have this policy document where government says this upfront. Okay, we need not care for it. In fact, prior to that, even in 2001, National Health Policy 2002, it stated the government cannot take care of the poor also, all by itself. So there have to be mechanisms where there is service delivery by the private sectors. Okay, so and those who can spend a little bit, they should be paying for their health. Government itself was washing its hands off. Now, if we come to the institutional, from policy framework to the institutional framework, of course, the way policy is made, it is bound to function, bound to impact the functioning of the institutions itself. Okay, so now given this push towards private sector, privatization, and this emphasis on quote unquote providing world-class healthcare. Now, who decides that what is world-class? What is provided in Massachusetts or in Harvard, that is world-class? Or the simplest of the technologies, the most affordable of the technologies, which can provide relief to the people for the problems that they suffer from, that is world-class. And the choice between the two is colored or guided by our own class orientation, our own class outlook and world outlook. Certainly, in a highly privatized, profit-oriented healthcare, you can be absolutely sure that the world class is something which originates from Harvard, from Massachusetts, not something which is dictated by the needs of the poorest of the poor in our country. Now, this means technology-intensive interventions and cures and treatments. Technology-intensive interventions and cures and treatments, where can they be provided? They will be concentrated, obviously, in large hospitals. Large hospitals, and where? In big cities. Why? Because it is there that the rich are living. Those who can afford to pay for these services are living. The rural rich can always come to the cities. They don't mind.
So 2 minutes.
Sure. Okay. So now you find that with this shift, the shift also happens in the way we treat our doctors, our technicians. Now, a doctor who feels supreme aplomb in reading a CT scan, but may fail to make out a lump or a swelling inside or something by simple techniques of palpation or auscultation and all that. That is what has become, the whole orientation of medical care, medical education has changed. You are producing doctors whose aspirations are very different. And aspirations are different also because now attaining medical education is not the same way as I attained it, by paying mere 400 rupees per year as college fees here in Delhi. Today, lakhs are being spent even before one enters a medical college. And you conduct a survey of all medical graduates in colleges in Delhi itself. Their career path is very, very clear to them. They know that after having cleared first professional, they will take, after having cleared second professional, they will take ECFMG Part 1, which is the exam for the qualifying exam to go to US. After doing their internship, they will take ECFMG Part 2. And thereafter, happily united body and soul in US. They're not even having to think. And then, can we expect the doctors that they will go and serve the people? I just want to highlight one example of what all of this can do to the psyche, to the thinking of our being. You see, in 1992, when Babri Masjid was demolished, I was junior resident doctor at UCMS and GTB hospital. And many areas around us, there were many Muslim localities and there were riots, of course, you all know that. At that time, we had an organization, Delhi Medicos and Scientists Forum. And we organized a relief work into those rioted areas. We've subsequently brought out a report also, and for which many of us, rather most of us, were hounded by the Home Ministry at that time. But nevertheless, there was a doctor, a class fellow of mine, who was part of that team. He subsequently became a very eminent neurosurgeon. Okay. And he was part of that team which went to those areas providing relief and all. For many years, I had been taking political contribution also from them. But then how things change. I was shocked when during this COVID crisis, migrant crisis, when it happened. And I was having some exchange with my friends and all, him included. And I wrote to him the way people are being made to suffer. And this pandemic is showing us the mirror. So he wrote back, and I quote verbatim, "I am in support of the policy decisions, that is the decisions for lockdown and all, taken, although they could have given 48 hours to reach wherever anybody wanted to go. You can choose between killing 1 lakh or 10 lakhs or maybe more. No decision or policy could save everyone. I'm not questioning your rationality, but you should also not think that what others are doing is always wrong. Also, when you condemn, tell what should have been done." And I can cite you many such examples. In fact, recently, the Medical Council of Karnataka, it had to issue a proper letter to its members, because many of the doctors in Karnataka, they were found to be propagating communal propaganda and calling for killing of the minorities. That letter is there in public. It's not a secret document. So I think now what is the way, if I may take just one more minute, I think that apart from framing, of course, there is a role for technology, there is a role for managerial skills, organization, and all those things. But apart from framing public health in techno-managerial terms, we need to frame public health in social and political terms, very, very categorical. And the way, one of the ways, apart from all the other eminent ways, would be that the public health people, the medical practitioners, medical professionals of various kinds need to be involved in people's trials and travails, their day-to-day struggles. And one example which I can cite was that during last farmers' agitation, we on behalf of Progressive Medicals and Scientists Forum, we organized massive medical relief efforts at all these camps. And I mean, I myself did not believe the kind of response that we'll get from the doctors. There were many who had never been in touch with us earlier and all, but somehow came to know that PMSF is organizing these camps, and they came along. And when last riots took place in Northeast Delhi after CA and RC, PMSF organized a medical relief camp and fact-finding into those areas. And again, we had some wonderful interns coming with us to lend their services and be a part. So I think along with theory, it is the practice of that theory and those theoretical precepts that will pave the path for a brighter future for public health and for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhajpai. So you reflected about the entire evolution of health services and public health in India, starting from Bhor Committee 1946 report. You provided critical reflections on with 3 national health policies which India has released. And then you also reflected about how the medical profession and doctors have, the medical doctors have changed their thinking and societal perspective in the last many years. I'm mindful of the time and there are 22 minutes. So instead of my questions, I think it will be a good idea if we open this for questions from other participants. Maybe we will take 2 questions at a time and people, the participant can raise their hands. We will take 2 questions. Please also speak that whom this question is directed to. And then we will go for another round of questions.
Priyanka? Mr. Leheria, but before the discussion round, before the question answer round, we will like to have a small 5-minute discussion on both the papers that will be conducted by me only. So, and post that we begin with question answers.
Sure.
So we just quickly try to understand and summarize what both the speakers had to say to the audience. So first of all, thank you so much for this very enriching and a very wonderful paper. Professor Priya was very right when she said that in order to look for answers in the present day, it is important for us to go back and look for answers in the history or perhaps the past. And I think both the papers, Dr. Bhajpai's paper and Professor Mehrotra's paper, dealt with historical insights of in public health, in the public health sector and in the public health movement. However, what was very primary to both the papers, and I would conclude and I will merge and speak, is the word liberation. I think liberation is the key word here. So why do I say that? Liberation, when Professor Priya said that public health sector needs to be liberated from authority of any nature, authority, be it the state, and perhaps and also the kind of health police that she spoke about. So in order for public health to progress, liberation from this kind of authority is very much important. Secondly, she spoke of how liberation of the public health professionals or perhaps people in this particular discipline is extremely important. So she said that, when it is important for professionals or the public health professionals who enter the discipline to understand what public health is all about. It's not merely, it is important to come out of the shackles of, narrow-minded thinking. And there is a requirement of confrontation within the self. She also spoke of how there is a requirement to merge different disciplines like statistics, mathematics, and public health all together in order to get a holistic approach to the problems of public health. And when I say liberation was also reflected in Dr. Bhajpai's paper, when he said that, in order to get a solution for public health problem, we need to locate the diversity and the differences in society, specifically in the case of India, which is an extremely diverse, country in terms of social, class, caste, race, regional diversity, etc. So the public health problems, or perhaps the public health solution, the policy framework, they need to be modulated as per the requirement of the society. But I'm very interested, and perhaps would also like to know from Professor Bhajpai, that how do we do this? When you say, I mean, of course, that's theoretically, it sounds extremely important and it sounds a critical intervention, but as you said, that both theory and practice should happen. So my question would be, how do we do this? How do we address diversity and come forward for a unified, perhaps not unified, but a plausible or an appropriate model of public health problems for the particular class, caste, region, whichever diversity we are locating at? One answer to my mind comes directly is via primary health care. One solution to this is primary health care. I may be mistaken, or perhaps I may be wrong, but what I could think of after hearing from you is the solution in primary. We can look for solution in primary healthcare by strengthening primary healthcare structures and centers in the country. Moreover, both the papers, theoretical, both of the papers spoke of theory. How do we? They gave a very critical reflection on the theoretical and the academic aspect of public health. They pointed out towards the problem which is not just financial, the problem which is not just about expenditure in public health, but problems which are more at the conscious level. When you say of liberating from state authority, when you say liberations of the public health professional themselves, these are problems which function at more conscious level than at policy level, or what you call at the financial level. So thank you so much. Very interesting insight. Thank you so much again. I would hand it over to the chair and move on for further discussions.
I think before we open for audience question, it will be fair that I invite Dr. Priya and Dr. Bhajpai for maybe 1 minute or 2 minute responses to the observation reflections shared by Priyanka Yadav. Dr. Priya, you may go first, I think.
I think I found it very interesting that Priyanka should look at liberation as the central concept in both the papers, because that's certainly what one could see through. But I don't know whether I communicated that I was talking about public health and its authoritarianism of the state vis-a-vis the public is one clear dimension which is a challenge in the present. And that is part of what could be the future, that public health could get used for authoritarian purposes and through authoritarian means which the public accepts because it sees it for its own good. And Dr. Vikas gave a very good example of that from another doctor friend. So how the plausibility of authoritarianism comes through institutions like public health. And therefore we need to think differently about health so that we can protect the public from the possibility of using public health for authoritarian ends? How do we preempt or prevent that possibility? Can we do that?
Thank you.
Dr. Bhajpai?
Yeah. See, the question is how do we build that synthesis for different sections of the society? Well, one thing which certainly is not the way forward is that you can't have different care for different kinds of people, maybe the caste, class, or ethnicity or region. The idea is to build a singular system in the sense which is singular in terms of principles, in terms of principles, though forms can vary as per local needs and diversified needs, but which has the singularity of principle, that the system is to be sensitive to the needs of sections of the society, and that it will think consciously about it and provide for it. Now, as to the way forward of doing it, well, one thing is that the larger people's movements for their livelihood issues, for their bread and butter, for their social survival, social economic survival, their dignity, these struggles which are going on, willy-nilly, these struggles, they pave the way for such an understanding to evolve, even in terms of health. Now, as regards, the point is where while these struggles are going on, there is a need for the health professionals, for public health professionals, for doctors or specialists of various kinds, for paramedical workers and all, to be cognizant, to be made cognizant of these varying needs of the society. Okay, and there is a need the need for them to respond to specific aspects of healthcare, the way it alienates healthcare from the people, and that need for them to respond to such things should be emphasized, and there should be attempts to bring them into struggles for that. For example, one of the issues we always took at various levels and wherever possible was this abolition of user charges in healthcare. Okay, I've been part of it ever since I was a medical student at various levels. Now, the issue of privatization of healthcare, issue of privatization of medical education. Okay, what this does to the people, what it is doing really, and how it is playing out in the society. How is it wreaking havoc with the people's health, ability to access care? Okay, so these are the kind of issues, because one is at the level of theory, you can identify very magnanimous ideas and theorize them, but at the level of practice, these ideas have to be concretized into certain actionable demands, action points around which you can mobilize people, around which you can mobilize the larger medical fraternity. And when I say medical fraternity, I'm not just talking of doctors and all, I'm talking of medical, paramedical, and all the people who are concerned with that. So at practical level, these issues need to be identified, and we need to work in that direction, towards that direction. This is what we've been trying to do, and I hope the coming future we will be enriched further in our understanding.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhajpai. So now floor is open for participant questions. Please raise your hands. So while we wait for some of the questions, I will reflect and maybe a question for
I
both.
had a question.
Yes, please. Yes, please go ahead.
Am I audible? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
again, I'm having trouble with my internet. But this question is more relevant to Dr. Vikas Bhajpai, I feel. I wanted to understand what is the scope for traditional medicine systems in the future of healthcare? We've talked about technology, we've talked about social movements, we've talked about a lot of things. I also wanted to understand, is there any scope for a fusion of traditional and modern medicine systems in the future of public healthcare in India and elsewhere? Thank you.
So before Dr. Bhajpai answer, if there are more questions, we can take one round of questions and that will save us time. Dr. Manindra ji is raising hand, please.
Thank you for this wonderful session. And the best thing of the session is that it has raised high philosophical issues along with concrete practical issues. So on the one hand, the session is suggesting that there is a politics of knowledge, and we need to intervene in that politics of knowledge and think of plurality of knowledge system coming together without rejecting one or the other, working on the strength of all of them. And the realist version is modified further. The modification goes very well with the creative theory group, which is actually based on our interaction with critical realism group, which is talking of plurality of epistemologies, but having links and constantly struggling for a universal, but that universal itself is not constant. That universal is constantly emerging and changing. So emergentist universal. I think this is a broad philosophical frame on politics of knowledge that we work with. So I think that's a wonderful theoretical and philosophical intervention. A lot of people ask us that how this 3 days conference, different panels on different themes are interconnected. I think most of the panels have these common issues coming up. They are throwing the challenges, our larger dissatisfaction with the existing system, and practical problems and theoretical and philosophical domains where we also want to enter. So thank you very much for that. There are a couple of things that I think I need to ask. One is that, why do you think, Professor Bhajpai, that this, despite the fact that public health is such an important thing, and we had in the initial few years after independence, a vibrant public health system, which collapsed badly in last few decades, and still there is no movement about it, or other movements, they are going on. They also do not raise any issue about public health. This is a very serious issue. We were contemplating that if somebody wants to do a radical politics in Bihar, probably two sectors are there which could be picked up immediately. One is public health, other is education, public institutions of education. But unfortunately, none of these issues are part of agenda of any political party, including the extreme left political party. They also don't talk about the public health. Why this disjunction is there? This is one. Second, you raised a very interesting question about education, health education, means the medical college education system. I'm witnessing this. Somebody very close to me has just done his MD, and we talk almost every day, and horrible stories I hear about the hospital. The young boy who entered as more or less radical left has come out with huge frustration, and now he thinks that there is no way out except to get into private sector and earn some money. So much of humiliation happens inside the hospital system. So much of valueless education, valueless medical education is going on in this country. Do you know any good study on the values being propagated by the health educators? I would like to really read that, or I'd like to get your reflection on that. So how do we counter that? Well, unless we do this, raising this kind of movement of public public health professionals, or connecting that with the radical movements all around, that seems to be very difficult to handle.
Sure. So my first request to you would be that please let me have an opportunity to meet that young, bright, young, frustrated doctor, and I hope I can convince him that there are ways out. Okay. Now the reason. Now first the question about this traditional medicine. You see, I do see a role for precisely the reason that traditional medicine is there where modern medicine is not there. Okay, that is, it is close to the people. Okay, it is there with them in the thick and thin of life, and where modern medicine is not there. At the same time, I am also of the opinion that I am never able to get myself to romanticize traditionalism in any way. Okay. Well, I do believe that, like all other people in every other part of the world, Indians were equally capable or equally incapable of devising ways and means for providing care to themselves, including medical care for themselves, as per the given knowledge at any particular point in time. Okay, so definitely some traditions which have continued for a very long period in history, they cannot be debunked lock, stock, and barrel. Neither, I think, in view of the modern knowledges or the knowledge that has been gathered with the development of science, technology, and progress in various fields of life, in view of that, neither is it true that all of what is traditional can be accepted lock, stock, and barrel. Okay, so now the point is, how do you remove the chaff from the wheat such that you are able to save the kernel? Okay, and I think most of the contestations which arise, even between me and Dr. Priya over here, and they arise often on this point of how to weed the chaff from the kernel, from the grain. Okay. So that is a longer topic of discussion and all, but then yes, I do see a role for traditional medicine. Okay, and provided it is, and this role can prosper only if it is seen in the process of learning from each other. Okay, so then only will it be possible that we can actually realize this kind of synthesis at any level as well. So that is the one thing. Now, as to the question which was raised by Professor Manindra Thakur, I wish to say one thing. You see, healthcare does become an issue in US. Healthcare does become an issue in UK or in France or in other developed countries. And there are specific reasons for this. And if I may point out the reason, it is something like this. Many times, as and wherever I have had the chance to go to villages and talk to people and all, I often ask them one question. What if you were asked, that government were to ask her, what would be your first, say, 7, 8 priorities in life, or wishes in life, which you would wish to be granted by the government? Were the government ever to make some such offer? In many of the villages and all, among their first few priorities would be something like, the government should improve the irrigation. We don't have water for irrigating our plants, or we don't get loans, or some such issues which are connected in a very, very immediate sense to their ability to be able to live, to safeguard their livelihoods. Okay. And invariably, health does not really figure in the list of priorities and all, which they say. Now, the point is, how do we look at it? Do we see that people don't want health, so let them not have health? Or we see that where is the people's lives at what level is it in the present? You know, when people are struggling for their daily bread, you know, from one meal to another, they are struggling simply to be able to live. I think if I were also in such a condition, I would rather move with the presumption that I will not fall ill. I will not fall ill today, I will not fall ill tomorrow, or maybe for another month or a year. Because I cannot afford to make provision for my illness separately in advance. For most of the people, illness comes as an inadvertent thing, as and when it happens, and then solutions or resources have to be marshaled to tackle this emergency as and when it arrives. Okay. For a majority of our people, they cannot plan for their health per se. Okay. But yes, they are under obligation to plan from where the next meal will come, or as the situation is arriving. How will they have means to buy any meal, whether they will be employed or not? Okay, so it is something like, you know, that only if my survival is ensured, will I be able to think of something which goes beyond mere survival. Okay, now insofar as maintaining functional health is concerned, I think unless one is really very sick or impaired by a particular kind of a health problem for which he or she has to take certain medicines or medical aid to be able to maintain a minimal level of functionality, that is another situation. But in the absence of any such identified condition, we maintain functional health by all other means which do not categorically fall in the sphere of healthcare person. Okay, we may go for a walk, we may do some little exercise, or simply that we may have our food as and when we can have an opportunity to have it. So I think that is one important reason why health never really becomes that kind of an issue. See, just, I mean, if I were to place myself, not say in the position of a landless agricultural labor, but simple youth in a district of Bihar who has done graduation or who has done high school, who has taken some form of a coaching for some getting certain kind of job, and I'm sitting at home. You know, my immediate need is that I be able to get that job. And for a marginal peasant also, his overriding concern through the year is be able to have at least that much of crop which will be able to bide his family over the most testing months of the year in terms of food security.
So, Dr. Bhajpai, thank you very much.
Yeah. So
for your
there
inputs.
are many other reasons, but I think I have just discussed the most important.
Yes, and thank you very much. I'm aware of the time, and organizing team is saying that. So the last 30 seconds for Dr. Ritupriya, and then we wind up.
Thank you, Dr. Chandkan. I think I just endorse what Dr. Vikas has just laid out in terms of why people are not standing up and demanding healthcare. But I also want to add to that this does not mean that they don't think about health and healthcare. They do. It is for us as researchers to understand, to capture that understanding and communicate it to the policy making and those who are shaping the structures that influence the way they are able to access healthcare. So this understanding is a role for critical thinkers to figure out. That is what is not surfacing. It does not mean that people are not doing. In fact, the major dichotomy one sees today is that what the state is providing and what people are doing are two very different things. People are doing things for health. It's not that they're sitting back when they're only looking at survival and livelihood. They're also taking steps for healthcare, which are very different from what the state is planning. And therefore, we need to recognize this great divide and try and bridge that divide. I see my role as one of a bridge between these two. And that's where I think we need to find our methodologies and theories to be able to do that kind of a bridge work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priya. So I would not attempt to summarize. I'll say that every single minute of talk by our esteemed panelists is worth listening. So please go back to the recording and listen, watch. And of course, this is a dialogue which just has started, need to be continued. Thank you very much for to the panelists and everyone who joined. And thank you very much. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really would like to thank the chair, the speakers, and also our lovely audience for being a part of this panel. And I also see your participation in our further sessions, which are, which are scheduled for the day. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. The recordings will be available, and again, the sessions are being live streamed, so everybody can go and have a look from there as well. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Share the link of the recordings and all.
Sure, sure.
On the mail, you have the mail ID.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Pinky, and thanks to the colloquium.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. May I now request Yogita to take over?
Good morning, everyone. I feel very glad to welcome you all to the 12th panel of Creative Theory Colloquium. The session is titled as Issues of Labor in Contemporary India. The session will be chaired by Dr. Arun Kumar, who's a former faculty at CESP JNU. We have 3 speakers in line. The first is Dr. Chirishri Das Gupta. She's a faculty at CSLG JNU, followed by Dr. Vibhuti Patel, who's the Vice President at Indian Association for Women's Studies and a former faculty at TIS Mumbai. Our third speaker is Dr. Shuchi Bharti, who's a faculty at Asian Law College. Dr. Shuchi will also be the coordinator. For the session. I would now request Dr. Shuchi to take over the session and start by introducing the theme of the panel. Over to you, Shuchi ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yogita. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Okay. So I extend my sincere gratitude to the team of Creative Theory Colloquium for providing me this great opportunity of coordinating the session, which has the presence of scholars of the country who have extensively worked for the cause, for different cause. And this panel specifically has people who have worked for the cause of labor in India, and who are also my mentors and teachers who have inspired me, and their work and writings I have followed and referred to from the beginning of my own academic life since today. So thank you again. Regarding today's panel on contemporary issues of labor in India, I would like to briefly introduce the theme. So what we have transplanted in India is the quest of prioritizing capital and undercutting the workers' rights question. Against this backdrop, the aim of panel discussion is the exploration into the transformations taking place in the nature of work, states' attitude, socio-political and economic realities, the judicial reasoning and interpretations proposed vis-a-vis the changes and impacts in India. The objective is to look at the significant challenges posed to labor, and as well as the socio-economic responses of this ongoing transformations. Labor and employment in the present context is observed to be surrounded by challenges of existential turmoil in India. A changing scaffold of labor market entails the ease of hire and fire, and diffuse and all-encompassing definition of what constitutes work. The proposal of labor reforms has not been welcomed with the equal cordiality by a worker as it has been praised by the capital. The state proclaims the rationale of the reforms to put to the capital and labor at the same plinth, but the problem is that irrespective of the constant claims, the action shows otherwise. What fails the state to harness the trust of the workers is an important question. As state claims to facilitate fairness while respecting the free enterprise through the flexibility being great for the worker rhetoric, the unflinching support to the techno-authoritarian state and capital alliance under the disguise of being non-interventionist and for the good for the working class continues. So the rationale of this panel of the colloquium has been drawn from varieties of intertwined attributes that compels the academia to inquire the subject more vigorously and closely while assessing the conundrum of policy, governance, politics, economics, and other underpinnings of the contemporary issues of labor in India. So without any further delay, I invite the chair of the session, Professor Arun Kumar Sir, for the commencement of the panel.
Thank you, Suchi, for inviting me, and I thank the organizer for inviting me to this workshop. I'll just make a few opening remarks, and then we can begin with the panelists. Now, what I want to say is that today, or rather for the last 30 years, we've been following the neoliberal paradigm of policies. And that explains a lot of what is happening vis-a-vis labor and workers. As argued by me in several articles, our policies are today based on what is called the supply side policies rather than demand side policies. Now, supply side policies are those that are not for increasing supply, but that are supposed to benefit the businessmen so that they can invest more. And that is what would then move the economy to a higher growth path. So that is the underlying basis of policies. And you can see that the Atmanirbhar Bharat package that was proposed during the, this pandemic in May 2020 of 22 lakh crores, that was also based on supply side policies. And as a part of that package was also the, the labor code that is being introduced, the farmers' bills that were introduced, and dependent basically on credit rather than giving more funds to the poor who are suffering as a result of the loss of employment and the loss of incomes that were there. And we have the study from Azim Premji, which showed that 80% workers said that they had lost incomes, and 90% said that they did not have enough funds to buy 1 week of supplies, and that's why they were starving, and that's why we saw crores of people marching from cities back to the villages in the hope that they would be able to get some food. So in a sense, the plight of labor today is because of the kind of policies that have been followed since 1991, and more specifically now that these supply side policies that are being pursued. Now, as the World Bank had said, the policies need to be market friendly. So these are what are called market friendly. So it's not that the state intervention has declined, but state intervention, which was in favor of the poor and others, now it is exclusively in favor of capital. So this is a change that came with the 1991 policies, which was supposed to be market friendly state intervention. Now, the other thing that we need to also look at is that the position of labor has declined all over the world. And the reason for that is that capital has become dominant given its mobility. It has become highly mobile, and as a result, it can move quickly from one country to another country, which is offering it concessions. So capital is able to make countries compete against each other. It is also because of capital's mobility that what is called the race to the bottom in terms of taxation that has come about. So direct taxes have been cut very sharply. This began with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. When they did not have capital in Eastern Bloc of Europe, they started cutting taxes, and therefore they started attracting capital. So whether it be Poland or other countries of the Eastern Bloc, but even Ireland cut taxes and capital started going there. So today Ireland is the place where large number of big corporates like Starbucks and so on are now basing their corporate from there. so that they can take advantage of low taxation. This forced other countries, Britain, Germany, France, etc., also to cut taxes, and that had an impact on the public goods provision, whether it be health, education, and so on. That has also penetrated into the developing world because everybody is competing for capital. So today's financial architecture is what is being used by capital to strengthen itself, and that is weakening labor. So in the IT sector, for instance, you don't have trade unions at all. But more than that, in India, the unorganized sector, which employs 94% of the workforce, did not have mobilization as trade unions, and they could not bargain for their rights. So it's a very tiny section in India which was actually able to mobilize and ask for their rights. So the weakness was already there. And I call the unorganized sector the reserve army of labor, which actually keeps the organized sector labor also very weak, because the salary differentials between the organized and the unorganized sector can be anywhere 5 times to 10 times. So if you lose a job in the organized sector, you'll slip into the unorganized sector at 20% or 10% of the salary that you were getting earlier. So you don't want to lose that position. And that keeps the organized sector also weak in the Indian context. So the question to ask is this weakening of labor, how is that affecting the position of labor? And that weakening is continuing further with the labor code that is proposed by the government, which the labor unions are opposing, but it doesn't appear that it is having much of an effect because state after state is adopting these labor codes, and now it might be adopted in the country as a whole. So the difficulties in mobilization of the unorganized sector is something that the organized sector needs to take care of, because without that, the organized sector also remains weak. Another factor that needs to be considered in all this is, apart from the international finance capital and its mobility, the technology. There's a rapid development in technology which is displacing labor. So, for instance, you have autonomous vehicles being experimented with and very likely to come in within the next few years, which will displace millions of truck drivers all over the world. Not that it'll get implemented everywhere equally fast, but the potential threat is there. Similarly, in India, we have seen that our neighborhood stores are being displaced by the e-commerce. Before the pandemic, a large number of people used to go to the stores of the middle class.
तेरी माँ की चूट, अरे बाकरी चूट, तेरी माँ की चूट काटो, तो तेरी बाकरी चूट, अरे
he should be removed. He should be removed immediately, and he's a troll. And do not allow anyone who is not known. I think general
keep them in the waiting room. Yeah, keep them in the waiting room.
So, as I was saying, technology has become the big disruptor, and it's weakening labor because it's creating massive unemployment all over the world, not just in India, but all over the world. And that weakness is something that we also need to understand. So, I think we need to address this question: how is the labor's consciousness formed? How is it that that consciousness transcends into movements? These are some of the issues that I thought I'd flag, which the speakers could address apart from whatever else they have in mind, which they are anyway going to address. So thanks for this thing, and I'll make my remarks later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the enlightening opening remarks. Now I would invite Professor Chirashri Das Gupta for her paper presentation. And along with that, I would also request Yogita to be ready with the slides whenever Professor Chirashri instructs you to play them. So over to you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, friends. I'm very grateful to Creative Theory Colloquium for getting me back once again after a brief hiatus, and especially grateful to Savita and Manindra and Shuchi, especially for thinking of me for this panel. I have bad cold, so I may sound a little throaty. Yogita, I request you to please put on the slide so that I don't waste any time in making my points. Okay, so my presentation is titled State and Capital in India, actually, Institutions of Labor Cheapening. And next slide, please. And Yogita, next slide. And I'll start with some data, which is about how the value that is produced in India has over time, like what has been the share of the workers especially, and what has been the share of capitalists, which is called the operating surplus. So as you know, that mainly it breaks up into two major portions: all value that is created, the part that is paid as wages, and also other kinds of compensation, because we don't get separate data on just wages. And the rest accrues to the capitalist as operating surplus, from which they pay, let us say, interest, etc., and then and other spendings, and retain the rest as profits. So if you see from the period 1980-81 to 1990-93, from the time we have consistent comparable data, the share of employees was about 56% in that entire 12 years, and the share of employers was about 44%. But right after liberalization, within 2-3 years, between 1993-94 to 1999-2000, the share of compensation of employees came down to 35%. Between 2004-5 to 2011-12 came down further to just 30%, and then increased a little bit as far as the private corporations, which is like the organized sector, is concerned, to about 36%. And consistently, what you can see is that the share of the, whether it's the organized public sector or where it is private corporations, irrespective of series, there has been a huge reversal in terms of the share of wages and compensation declining, while the operating surplus has increased.
remove because
Very magnitude. Very magnitude. What?
Hello. Somebody is there?
Supriya, remove them and don't allow anybody to enter.
Don't allow anyone to be on.
Let them watch on YouTube now.
Yeah.
Just log it now.
My slides have been actually
Yeah,
vandalized.
I can see.
So maybe.
So sorry for that, we removed him.
Yeah. So
can we remove this?
Can we reload it and then start?
Reload, yeah, reload it.
Yeah. Yogita, please close this and reload the file to see if it's the original file.
Yeah. I'll just do that.
We cannot see it properly. Okay.
Is it fine now?
Yeah, it's absolutely.
It's coming now.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. So please go to the next slide. So the point I was making is that, as you can see, that within 3 years after the big liberalization of 91, the compensation of employees drastically, the percentage share went down. And there was a reversal. And if you take the decadal thing from 2011-12 to 2019-20 overall, like in the economy, then the workers' share is come down to about 38%, while the employees' share is around 62%. Okay? So this reversal in some ways actually has a very important dimension in terms of the points that were made by Professor Arun Kumar in terms of about what has been happening in the last 3 decades as far as workers are concerned. That out of the value that is created in the economy, the share of workers is consistently drastically declined and then remained consistent at a level which is like almost half of what it used to be till 1992-93. Next slide, please. We can skip this. I've already talked about it. The next one. So now I go into the some other kinds of data, a different kind of data. This is from the annual survey of industries. And I request you to follow this a little. This is the one that will take a little bit of time, but this is central to the arguments that I'm going to make, which is that if you take the second column, which is wages to total value of output. So in 1989-90, for every 100 rupees of value that was produced, 6 rupees 54 paise used to go to labor. Okay, because this is just pure wages. Because what I was showing you earlier was wages plus salaries plus other kinds of compensation. So it actually includes even those inflated CEO salaries. Okay? And that means that if you take that out, the actual share of labor would be even smaller than what I showed you. So here we get a more rounded idea from the annual survey of industries. And what you see is that by the 2013-14, this had reduced to less than 2 rupees. And the value of 2 rupees today is much less than the value of, because these are current prices, 2 rupees in 89-90, right? So basically for every 10 rupees of value that is produced in the economy, just 23 paisa on an average goes to labor. So this is the extent to which labor cheapening has taken place in India. And labor cheapening is the basis of accumulation in India. And this is something that is at a level where it is if you see, the decline has been more than threefold. Now, then I move to the third column, which is net value added to wages, which is kind of a proxy of what Marx called the rate of exploitation, which was surplus, how, like for every rupee of wages paid, how much is the surplus that is created. And so you can see that in 1989-90, for every 100 rupees of wages, 283% of value added in which would go into the making of surplus was paid in. Today, by 2013-14, this was more than 700, and today it is around 2017-18, it is 637. So once again, you can see that just as the share of wages has declined threefold in total value, the rate of exploitation in a certain ways has increased almost threefold. Now, then we go to the last column, which is material inputs to wages. So this also gives sort of what Marx called the organic composition of capital. And even if you don't, or the technical composition of capital, but it can also be in liberal terms thought of as technology intensity. And what you can see is that over time, like the capital labor ratio, you can think of it in other ways as the capital labor ratio, has also increased, okay, from 12 to about 40 in 2014-15, but then that is also decreasing. And this is something I'm leaving for exploration, because we need more data to really ascertain whether we are going back to a regime that is more labor intensive, and other evidence seems to suggest so. And the reason that is happening is, you can see, is in the second last column, because while the rate of exploitation has increased, the operating surplus, share of operating surplus has increased. In the post-liberalization period, there has been a decline in the rate of profit for capital, which suggests that capital in India actually is seeing a tendency of decline in the rate of profit to the point where it is at 11% in 2017-18. So it suggests not a simple, there is an expansion of absolute profits as we see, but also it indicates a certain kind of crisis of profitability as far as Indian capital is concerned. And however, don't mistake this to think that like their absolute profits are declining. So out of the net value added, what they are doing is they're appropriating more and more capital as profit. So in 1989-90, just 19% of the net value added accrued as profit, while today it is about 47-46%. Next slide, please. So in this background, I want to put my main argument, borrowing from Polanyi's, that this suggests over time a shrinking of the relative autonomy of the state and a shift in the balance of class forces in terms of the narrowing of the class basis of the Indian nation state in favor of capital as against labor. Now, in this, I want to particularly examine how labor cheapening, instead, and I'm not going to talk so much about policy because policy is something I really believe, and I've argued elsewhere, that policy changes in itself do not augur much unless you look at underlying institutional continuities and changes. And so I'm going to focus my short presentation on the reliance on labor cheapening and the institutions that have been harnessed for this, which while Shruti mentioned non-intervention, I would argue that both intervention, selective intervention and largely non-intervention, both together have been cleverly used to maintain labor cheapening as the sole basis of accumulation in India, which continued from the previous decades and intensified in the period under consideration, that is in the period of neoliberalism. And this is particularly true of the last decade, and I want to make certain additional points about that as we go along. Next slide, please. So the first legal institution that I want to bring to your notice is the Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, which was adopted in October 1947, 2 months after independence by the Constituent Assembly, and in which basically all employer-employee relations, regardless of what the workplace was. So from domestic workers to workers in places of worship, to factory workers, to service sector workers, everybody was covered by the Industrial Disputes Act, which gave not only certain kinds of rights to workers, but also this is the most universal form of workers' rights that was ever given in India. But the chambers of commerce like FICCI, etc., right from the beginning started opposing this, and through a series of events, which for lack of time, I don't want to go into, but if you want to know, we can later in the discussion bring those up. By 1956, FICCI created enormous pressure on the government and the government of the day. And by 1956, the new Industrial Disputes Act was brought in, which defined the worker through the workplace. And the workplace is defined by a certain size of factory with a certain capacity of horsepower, and accordingly the workers was defined. So essentially it meant that male factory workers in certain kinds of not even micro or small enterprises, but certain bigger factories. And this is how informality was institutionalized in India, okay, right in the first decade after independence. And so this idea that informalization has increased is true, but if you look at independence, the ratio between formal and informal was 40:60. But today that is, as you know, like 5:95, and the institutionalization of this particular way of progress through informality as the dominant form of labor deployment is something that was institutionalized right after independence. The second point that I want, so this was an selective intervention. The second point is the non-intervention, which is the graded hierarchy of labor that existed on the basis of caste, the co-constitution of caste, patriarchy, and class was something that was kept intact without any kind of, so while untouchability became a crime, but caste system itself was not criminalized, right? And so basically the caste and patriarchy as the basis of a grade, maintaining what Ambedkar called the graded hierarchy. I call it the graded hierarchy of labor, in particularly social reproduction, was maintained to keep labor cheap. And I want to bring just two examples of, like, I did a survey between 2018 and to 2020 till the about the first month of the pandemic of about 1,800 domestic workers and 300 sanitation workers, okay, in various institutions as well as home deployment. And what we find is that three things. The first is the huge difference between the compensation, wage or income compensation between in institutions, between the top, like take JNU, where what I found was the average salary of the top player of the that is the faculty members, the average salary across positions is about 1,20,000, while that of the sanitation workers were 3,000 to 6,000. So this level of inequality is something. Similarly, for domestic workers, what I found was not more than 4% of the household income is spent on the wages paid to domestic workers. This can only be explained, and I've argued once again in my work elsewhere, that is based on the definition of skills, which is defined by the state through the national skills, the definition of skills and hierarchization of skills, which is based on a pure Brahminical distinction between mental and manual labor. Okay. Then the third is that I want to, the second is how unpaid work is mobilized through paid work. So two examples. Domestic workers are actually contracted for piece work, cleaning, cooking, washing utensils, and there is a, for each kind of work, there is a certain monthly rate. However, once they come into the house, they are made to do many other jobs, odd jobs, okay, which are not part of that unofficial contract. So from watering plants to child care, like holding the baby, looking after the baby, to making tea, etc. Many things which are actually unpaid work mobilized through paid work. Okay? So there is a continuum between paid and unpaid work. Similarly, for sanitation workers in institutions, like they are mobilized at odd job persons. So they just don't do sanitation work. So when there are events, they are made to serve tea, they are made to pull furniture, made part of the organizing thing, and all of this once again is unpaid labor. So the third that I want to talk about, and I'll just touch on this and go on, which is that things like Jodi labor. This is emergent new forms of bondage where husband and wife and the kid comes free are contracted as a family in construction sites. And obviously the rate that would have been paid to the, if they were working as individuals separately, is much less than what is paid as a family, because the woman's work is undervalued. And Sumangali labor, you may know, which is, there's a lot of work on it now, which is young women are contracted to raise their dowries for 3 to 4 years to work in hosiery industry, which is largely an export-oriented industry, who live in chattel slavery-like conditions with like immense kind of violence, starvation, sexual violence, etc., and subjected to unregulated work. And even though this is now legally sort of has been banned because of voices being raised internationally, uh, uh, because this is an export-oriented industry, still this custom is very much pervading. And these are fastest growing sites of accumulation, this fastest growing sectors of the economy, like construction and export-oriented textile industry. Next slide, please. The last 3 points I want to make is, apart from this, there is the pattern of labor intensification in the name of flexibility. And we are all familiar with this, various modes of contractualization that has happened over time. And basically, the fundamental right to form unions has been taken away by increasingly raising the number of minimum people needed to form a union. Earlier it was 7, and now then they increased this to 100, and then it has been increased further. And so what you now have is, it is very difficult to form unions in itself, which would be recognized unions. And moreover, the tripartite negotiation system of states, capitalist organizations, and government, which was put in place after independence, is something that has been eroded completely. And added to this is, of course, the dispossession, deprivation, and accumulation that we've seen over time, and this has intensified under neoliberalism, from Vedanta to like a huge number of examples that we can take, and which the more displacement takes place, the more vulnerable labor becomes, and it is more easy to then cheapen labor, because if you are so vulnerable, if your vulnerability increases, you are willing to work on very, very onerous terms, because there is no collective bargaining possible on your behalf. Now, added to this, in the last under the present regime, in the last since 2015, I would say 16, what we see is a new form that is emerging, and I want to spend just a couple of minutes on this, which I called insecure citizenship through document terrorism. So, you label a certain section of the population, especially Muslim minorities, but also Christians and others, as people who are designated as foreigners, who are designated as not enough citizens in various ways. There is a social license to lynch, kill, rape. This has also happened to Dalits. And this then leads directly to not only, of course, the physical violence and harm, which is always talked about, and the threat of like physical security, etc., but this creates an entire group of insecure citizens. And of course, things like the CAA and the NRC then create a kind of document terrorism to further strengthen this insecure citizenship. And if you look at if you take parallels from what happened to Mexicans and Latinos, for example, in the USA, it is similar, that you keep people so insecure as citizens that they can't claim even citizenship rights, leave alone labor rights, and through violence they are dispossessed, and they are often whatever little security they had in terms of economic security also goes. And then this adds further to the process of labor cheapening, because then like building up new livelihoods would be very difficult, and hence once again you create an entire new pool of people who will work at very, very low rates. So all of these institutional processes actually shows that this entire project is not merely a political, it is a political project, but it is a political project in favor of big capital to facilitate labor cheapening by deploying caste and patriarchy, and now religion as well, But what we can see is that there is a crisis of profit rates, which I started with, as I showed you, a real crisis, because if you go on cheapening and depressing wages so much, then after it, real wages so much, over time you erode workers' abilities to buy, and hence there is a demand compression in the economy, which is bound to then lead to a crisis of profitability. So it is a very delicate balance. And this system, as I showed you, that if you are paying 23 paisa for every 10 rupees of output, labor is virtually free in India. So, and still the rate of profitability is falling. So in this situation, it is a very delicate balance of social engineering that is going on. But if this economic pressure keeps building in terms of demand compression and people being destituted over time, then it can collapse at any moment. And so this building towards that rupture, to really bring about that time where this institutional basis of accumulation can be ruptured from below in terms of a more favorable conditions for labor, is what I think all of us and the social and labor movements and political movements, progressive political movements, need to work for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chirashri ma'am. And now I would request Professor Vibhuti Patel to kindly begin.
I think, Professor Patel, you have to unmute yourself.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Savita Singh and Dr. Yogita Agarwal for this opportunity to be part of an esteemed panel curated by Creative Theory Colloquium 2022 and organized by Creative Theory Association with International Herbert Marcus Society. I have a PowerPoint presentation and I would like the right to share my PPT. I'm disabled to share the PPT.
We will enable in 1 minute.
Yeah. So my presentation focuses on
Yes, ma'am. Check. You are now enabled to share your screen.
Yes, I'm able to see it. Yes. So as you can see, my presentation is focused on gender and labor concerns, and it is informed by the theoretical framework of critique of neoliberal macroeconomic policies, as I think in the concept note, I think Dr. Arun Kumar also emphasized, human development approach and right-based approach, intersectional gender perspective, and need for engendering macro, meso, and microeconomies to ensure dignified life to the working class, and also the recent debate about Revdi culture and freebies. I think we need a paradigm shift from this kind of frivolous discourses to proactive action agenda for the right to food, right to education, right to employment, right to skill, right to social security and social protection, and the freedoms from hunger, malnutrition, inaccessible education, skills, and diseases, freedom from diseases. Now, coming to the question of a demographic reality, we know that the sex ratio is currently, as per the Niti Aayog data, it is alarmingly adverse. At one level, birth rate is going down. More than 20 states are below stabilization. That means couples are producing less than 2 children, but the price is paid by the girl child. And we also have a major challenges of the reproductive health because of 2 years of pandemic. All the reproductive health services were dismantled, and what we need is a previous session, as it showed that how public health system has been attacked severely with the neoliberal influence in the healthcare sector. Now, this graph also shows us that both birth rate and death rate have gone down in India. Malnutrition is a major problem which the working class is facing. Anemia among women is more than 50 to 60% and resulting in a maternal mortality rate. And every 3 men using healthcare facilities in city of Mumbai, we see only 1 woman uses it. So there is a 1/3 utilization of healthcare facilities by women. And nutrition is a major challenge that they are facing. When it comes to the education sector, most of the working class population and the labor, they are facing major challenges. Currently, 3 crore Indian children are out of school, out of which 1 crore are women. So getting last moment connectivity in this so-called online or a hybrid form of education is a major challenge. And whatever gains that we had over last 150 years of education journey, I think they have been wiped out, and this is a major challenge. India's promise to sustainable development goal, in that also we see that currently nearly 1/4 of the women are not able to access higher education. Persons with disability are facing major challenge in all their developmental needs. Gender-based violence has escalated. Now it is in this and people with disability, they are also facing none of the citizenship rights are available to them. And we need to, the whole question of gender binary, of just coming up with the policy intervention only for men and women, leaves out the sexual minorities, especially the transgender population and their developmental needs. So it is in this overarching reality that we need to locate the work participation. And I think my previous speaker has also given an exhaustive and convincing database about how the labor is cheapening, labor is losing out. 92% of the workforce is in the informal sector. And there is a gender gap also. There is a defeminization in the agricultural sector, in the urban, in the informal sector. The condition is very, very precarious. 40% of women who were earlier in a pre-pandemic period were in the labor force. They are out of work. Massive occupational diversification is taking place in the Indian economy, and occupational segregation results into segmentation of women in the low-paid, dead-end, monotonous employment. And there are mobility constraints. So UNDP studies have also shown women in a digital economy, they are also at the lowest bottom of the pyramid, and where there are hardly any chances of professional growth. None of the training programs, out of more than 250 training programs by the Industrial Training Institute, most of the time women are segregated only in the say tailoring or screen printing. None of the other skills are given. There is a major data crisis because visibility of gender in statistics and indicators, that is a major challenge that we are facing. Even in the discourse on migration, the focus was on male migration. When it comes to even labor codes, the whole language of the labor codes, 4 labor codes, whether it is about the wages or labor standards or industrial relations, social security, social protection, there is hardly any mention of women. The whole language is in terms of he, him, and his. Only when it comes to maternity benefits, they have mentioned it. Even sexual harassment at workplace, which is a major challenge in the informal sector and also in the organized sector, there is no talk about it. When it comes to sanitation and recycling work, which needs a major technological intervention, none of the state governments except Kerala and Delhi to some extent have brought in new technology. Women who are in the workforce, they are facing various, as you can see in the various rounds of NSSO, that how the occupational structure is changing. In the primary sector, there is a defeminization from 1983 to 1983-84, which was 87%, which is reduced to now 73% by 2017-18. While in a secondary sector, there has been increase from 7% to 13%, and in the service sector, tertiary sector, there is increase from 5% to 13%. But still, in the pyramid of the workforce, like hierarchy of the workforce, women are in a graded hierarchy. I think the women are at the bottom. When it comes to unpaid care work, about which for the first time we have a macro level data provided by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, here this bar chart also shows that how when it comes to unpaid caregiving, unpaid domestic services, women are found in a major proportion of women are engaged in, and 10 times more energy of women is utilized, where Indian women spend 299 minutes per day doing unpaid work, while men spend 99 minutes. So the question of recognition, redistribution of care work, so the changing the gender norms becomes very important. Care work is not only whether it is a child care, elderly care, or housework, is not only the responsibility of women. We need to change the mindset of the people and change the gender norms, because even as compared to other Asian countries, this kind of a skewed distribution of care work between men and women is there, more pronounced in India, even when we compare it with the other South Asian and other Southeast Asian countries. Recognition of care work, very important, and the measure of time use. Now, for the first time, we have had time use. There are limitations of TUS, this time use service, because it also uses the recall method of last for 24 hours of your work. It has its own limitation because there is a seasonality in Indian economy. People are doing different activities in different seasons. And also we need to reduce care work by times labor saving technologies for a drudgery prone, stigmatized and hazardous work. And also those who are into care work, they also should be paid the adequate and respectable wages so that they can lead dignified life. Now, feminist political economy of everyday and theorization of social reproduction, of gender structure of everyday power and agency impacting everyday life within the neoliberal individuation has been a major discourse globally as well as in our country in the post-pandemic period and even during the pandemic. So recently we have seen some of the progressive judgments by the family courts where value of homemaking and unpaid care work, because when men want to dispose of their middle-aged wives and they said they won't pay a penny because they have cooks and they have domestic workers who do their work. So the courts have given progressive judgments by using time use survey and by using the time allocation that these women have invested over the years in managing their family and the relationships. In Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh High Courts, homemakers were compensation for the loss of future prospects. We saw even a very important judgment in 2010 by Supreme Court of India, where Arun Kumar Agarwal versus National Insurance Company Limited, where the wife of Mrs. Renu Agarwal died due to road accident, and the insurance company did not want to pay compensation, and they were forced because the time use analysis was used. So the gender economists were consulted by the judges. In the Madras High Court judgment, where Rakhi Kotari versus Sundarappan, where again the accident compensation case, housewife who was pregnant and she also and she had abortion as a result of this accident, she was compensated. And we also saw Kirti versus Oriental Insurance Company Limited, in which also value of women's labor and the homemaker was acknowledged by the court. So these are some of the progressive trends that we see. I need to switch on my my battery was good. So when it comes to women in informal sector, what we have seen that grim reality of 92% of women in the workforce who are into export-oriented industries, production of leather goods, toys, food products, garment, diamond jewelry, and artificial jewelry. Piece rate female labor is employed, and even home-based workers in cities like Mumbai or Madras or Bangalore, we have seen. They are and there are women who are working from the sweatshop. There was a major struggle in Tamil Nadu and Kerala for these women working in the shops, working in as a sales girl, who were not even allowed to sit there. They had to work for 12 hours a day, but they were not even given bench or a stool to sit. So there was a big, they filed public interest litigation. These young women workers got organized and they won the case in the court. And now they have attain the right to sit. Imagine these are the simple things which any worker we would take it for granted that when there are no customers, you would be allowed to sit, but that doesn't happen. Condition of domestic workers, I think there are n number of studies and rapid assessment studies done during the pandemic and also in the pre-pandemic period, which shows that what we need is a central legislation for domestic workers. Only one state, Maharashtra, has at least done the census of domestic workers, partial census, and they are given I-card, but none of the social security or social protection measures are being granted to domestic workers. And ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers, they have been applauded by the World Health Organization. They have even rewarded ASHA workers, and we have even declared them as best Corona warriors, most humane Corona warriors, but they don't even get minimum wages as per the of the state, or no, they are given only honorarium, and none of the social security benefits are given to them. And they have got nationally, they have got unionized, and they are asserting their rights. When it comes to migration, in whole discourse on migration, invisibility of women becomes very prominent, and women migrate, and even the data system also shows women migrants only. Women migrate due to marriage. When it comes to men, the data would say that men migrate due to for work or for education. But even after getting married, wherever these women go, they are working. So that aspect that is not brought in the economic discourse. And now there are women studies scholars who are showing that what were they doing at the native place and what are they doing at the destination place, the profile of their work. In a smart city discourse, what we need is that housing, urban housing becomes a very important concern for the laboring class, because in most of the cities, 40 to 60% of the workforce lives in the urban slums without any facility. And we saw the kind of crisis and the human miseries it created during the pandemic. As per 2011 census, we had 30.9 million women as migrant workers. That means 3 crore women who are migrant, but they were classified, 85% of them were classified as migrated due to marriage. But now, what do they do after marriage? What kind of work they are doing, that also needs to be netted. In the agricultural sector, we see is a defeminization of rural agriculture workforce due to commercialized agriculture, mechanization, and massive land alienation that is happening due to infrastructural projects. In 2004, 533% of women were there in the agriculture sector, which reduced to 25%. And in 2018-19, it became 19% as agriculture worker. So possibility of underestimation can be there, and because women have multiple employers and multiple work. So you may be agriculture worker during the monsoon, but other time you may be working in a construction site or as a road worker or in a domestic work or as helper. So that it is possible. The major challenge is the unequal wages, even when the state is employer. Even in MG Narega, so many studies have shown that women are getting sometimes 2/3 or 1/3 of the wages, because of the contractors and subcontractors. They also believe in this kind of unequal treatment to women for doing the similar kind of work, or they may be slightly different kind of work, which if the men are doing digging, so you pay more wages for digging the pit. But when do loading and unloading, you are paying less, which is the work which is done by women. Anything work done by women suddenly is classified as unskilled because of this kind of a patriarchal bias of the employers. And they use the patriarchal bias for paying less wages to women. Women farmers don't have identity cards. We have 8% of women who have land ownership right, and unless you own land, you don't get Kisan cards. So women farmers, even when they are de facto cultivators, they don't get subsidized electricity, fertilizer, subsidized irrigation, or even seeds. So that is that issue. These issues were brought out during the farmer struggle. Women farmers had their special 3-day national convention, and they brought out the Charter of Demand. Employment generation in the agro-processing and economic activities in the non-farm sectors. These are other two very important areas where women are used as the cheapest labor. When it comes to tribal population, 11% of laboring class is in the tribal area. They are based on, their activities are based on forest-based economy, and they do collection of forest produce, which contribute to nearly 3,800 crores per annum to the GDP of our country. But still, their rights are not, none of their rights, whether as workers or for social protection. In fact, the most deplorable condition of the workforce is in the tribal areas, where they don't even have access to food or healthcare facilities or shelter or medicine or cash income. Women in fisheries, they are also facing major crisis because of the multinational giants, transnational giants have entered the field. Women who are the vendors and women who don't have any kind of technology, the fisherwomen don't have any technology or a refrigeration facility. They are the one at the receiving end. The shelf life of their products are also very limited. Handloom sector has faced a major attack by even demolition of the handloom board. In any case, like over the time, right from 1981, when we saw there was a decline of the handloom sector. Handloom sector is the largest employer of women after agricultural occupation in the rural areas, and that is facing major challenge recently, and especially after the liberalization, where Indian handloom is competing with so many other textiles products which are dumped in the Indian market. As a result of this kind of situation, feminization of poverty, a lot has been written about feminization of poverty and the women-headed household who are facing major challenge, because these are the household managed by widow, separated, single, and unmarried, and women facing long-term male migration. Occupational health and safety is a major casualty in the informalization. So the and also problems of women vendors, waste recycling workers is very deplorable. Safety of women at workplace, I think that is, we have a law, 2013 law, but nothing is happening. When it comes to the skill India, Make in India, Startup India, Atmanirbhar India, where women are completely marginalized, and there is a demand by the gender economies that at least 30% of the resources in these schemes, flagship schemes, should be.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm completing. Now we are talking about the future of work, gig economy, platform-based economy, temping, automation, massive automation, and application of robo in the manufacturing sector, artificial intelligence in service sector. I think in this context, women are the major losers, because they are quote unquote not job ready as per Niti Aayog. And my previous speakers have also spoken about the labor codes, that how they are detrimental to the interest of women. We are facing major challenge in terms of gender pay gap, sexual harassment at workplace, erosion of labor standards evolved by the recent work concept of ILO, occupational health hazards, hire and fire policy in favor of employer. More than 12 states have started implementing labor codes, and they have given up labor standards of 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure, and 8 hours of rest. As against that, they are demanding 12 to 16 hours of work. There are so many shop floor level struggles happening, but nothing, media is not even, there is a complete media blackout and invisibilization of women workers. So it is very important that now we need to have a gender responsive transformative agenda for gender equality. Gender economists are asking for gender responsive budgeting to address the issues of gender gaps in the workforce, and we need a very important visibility of gender in statistics and indicators, financial allocation for gender equality, affirmative action for enabling work environment, and protective legislations which we have won over last 150 years of collective struggle by the working class. 48 central legislations and 200 state-specific legislation. We have to safeguard them, we have to fight for them, and boost the local and local economies and gender mainstreaming in all flagship programs of the state and non-state ventures we have to strive for. So these are some of the references I have used for my PPT, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Patel. I would now like to request Dr. Shuchi Bharti to come in for a presentation.
Thank you so much, Yogita, and thank you so much, Professor Patel, for such an elaborated and such important aspects on labor you have presented. So today, after hearing all of you, my presentation would just be an add-on reiterating the arguments that have been in the discourse already. So the work I'm presenting specifically focuses on the few aspects that have always been of paramount importance. And that also sort of pushes the creative theory fraternity to scrutinize the whole idea of projection. in the domain of labor and employment. You know, how this fine-grained strategic psychological movement towards our understanding of what work and labor meant and what it means is now tweaked. Such projections do play a very pivotal role in state and capital partnership and influences the logical interpretations of the minds of the citizenry as well. If not always, but many times. So I would try to make it possible to understand that how in the domain of labor and employment, this psychological projection or the strategic manifestation of the definitions of how we understand work, how we feel that, okay, many of us are influenced that hire and fire is fine for the growth, etc., etc. We can take up these important aspects that could be expected, which I am trying to portray right now. So these created projections on the contrary of actual happening influences or rather manipulates the de facto thinking and understanding process in the minds of people. So my focus would not be only about talking about the changing context of law, regulation, governance, or underlying institutions, but also how there have been strategic manifestation, not only at the level of state, but also at the international governance structure that totally metamorphosizes the thinking and believing of multiple aspects of work, labor, and employment, such as what employment means to us, what being in precarious employment means, and what about modern threats to the workers, such as automation, skill and de-skilling, feminization of work, and many other related aspects can come under this whole gambit of the projected strategic manifestation, which I want to talk about. So I would try to, we are already going ahead of time, but I would try to stick to the time limit. And my focus would be primarily around few central points, understanding the strategic manifestation of how the state and international governance arena have defined and redefined the meaning and interpretation of work. And there has also been a heavy re-regulatory activities happening that clearly paves way to the techno-authoritarian alliance between the state and capital. So what does this techno-authoritarian alliance do? It sort of disowns or vilifies the pro-collective and pro-protectionist ideology to be absolutely bad for the health and wealth of the nation. How being pro-labor is actually portrayed as anti-labor through this revised language, and it is being asserted not to be in the interest of the growth and sustainability of the labor as well. So while understanding this, parallelly, one could also draw the genealogical framework as Professor Patel and Professor Das Gupta has already talked about, and even Professor Arun Kumar, that the genealogical framework that talks about the event that have taken place as the ideological transformation took place from collective protectionist one to more of the one which champions flexibilization. So the effort to include every casual, temporary, seasonal kind of paid engagement as work at the level of international discourse and within the nation has become a reality. So largely the attempt has been to establish a flexible labor market with the melting boundaries as well as the wavering trajectories to include the employment relations coherent with the profit motives. I'm no way claiming that this phenomenon is new, but what is the contemporary edition of the same is that this movement is sustained by the state by many ways, such as the heavy re-regulatory activities, weakening of legal fabrics, modifying institution, and very importantly, flexibilization, with also introduction of, one can say, short-term employments, easy hire and fire, etc. So citing Nancy Fraser and her idea of flexibilization has become of significant importance with respect to my work. So what it entails that the hallmarks of flexibilization could be understood as the temporal horizon of no long-term provisionality as well as fluidity. So once we look the employment relations and other related things through this lens, what we see that endorsing a non-standard and atypical form of employment policy has become normal, as as normal as the formal employment relations, and a renewed recognition of informal employment is there, but with an add-on to normalizing the inherent pernicious component it entails. Okay, so now bringing the focus on, as I said, the international categorization of non-standard forms of employment, which has broad components such as temporary employment, and it may constitute fixed term employments, also on-call employment, casual nature of work, work done on daily basis, part-time basis, on-call basis, etc. So the reasoning of the international governance structure like ILO and the confirmation of non-standard employment relations are indeed a matter that needs to be debated. So what we have observed in the present times, according to the ILO and other such organizations, the growth of non-standard employments is somewhat, they claim that it is an outcome of multiple forces. It reflects changes in the world of work brought about by, say, globalization or social change. ILO also agrees at times that laws and policies have also encouraged the use of non-standard forms of employment, but merely by identifying non-standard forms of employment and categorizing the same in different forms, it seems the international governance structure is not only downplaying the issues of vulnerability and precarity attached to them, but in the process, it also justifies the existence and showing little intent to discuss about, say, abolition or replacement with a more protected forms of employment. And as we have witnessed that ILO has mostly taken a moral high ground historically, at least on papers. So that's not even happening now. So international governance arena discusses about the gaps and gray areas of the law and policy that have provided fertile ground for the development of non-standard work arrangements, but does not indicate the need to check the proliferation of the same. While there is, what we see is the global movement towards re-regulating the worker protective laws and establishment of flexible regulatory measures. Surprisingly, what we witness is the eerie silence over this absolutely disquieting movement, where just about any kind of work, absolutely overshadowed by the clouds of insecurity, precarity, invisibility, is not only overlooked, but they are also normalized to the extent that all kinds of problematic aspects related to on-call, temporary, contractual, and many other unsettling employment arrangements are finding place and legitimacy in our legal framework as valid forms of employment. So we can see these labor codes. I'm not going into detail, but once we go and deconstruct the language of the labor codes, you will find even the gig work and on-call and everything has been given equal status as the formal employment in terms of its recognition, but not in terms of its betterment. So the attempt of this techno-autocratic alliance is not on focusing on how such arrangements minimize or more people tread the path from precarity to more secured forms of employment. Rather, the trend, what we are seeing in India is that there is outright acceptance. There is normalization, of course, and there is promotion of such arrangements in the name of more people getting involved into economic value creation. Looking at the nature of work and employment relations and its interaction with the impacts of law, regulation, and politics, inherently it has been observed that the state in the contemporary environment marked by promoting and thriving free market constantly argues and enumerates the positive relationship between business profitability and public good, to the extent of deriving a significant positive correlation between growth of the capital vis-a-vis the insecure nature of the employment and connecting all to the common good. So what is more unsettling for us as academia is witnessing a wave of researches and theories with or without being endorsed by the regime, some being endorsed, some not being endorsed, but they confidently assert two very, very problematic arguments. The first one is, of course, the foremost and the biggest responsibility of the state is to safeguard the capitalist interest. And the second, the idea of regulatory employment protection is mythical. It's irrelevant in the present world order. So much so that it goes on accusing the protectionist legislations to be problematic and should be replaced with immediate effect, with a framework that does not put burden on the capital. And arguments like such add a great deal of connotation of goodness to the capital and imposes detestation for the attribute of pro-collective and pro-protectionist regulation. So this binary, what I feel needs to be substantially rebutted in the present times by all of us, as the labor and employment framework honestly is in a deep crisis and in the state of existential turmoil in India. While completely changing the socio-legal and techno-economic milieu of the labor and employment fabric, it is argued by the state also that if the employer and employee are both granted a set of non-restrictive, legally enforceable claims instead of highly protective provisions of legislation, their respective positions are safeguarded in the market economy. So such arguments have placed in, they have a placement which is indicated through a movement towards doing away with the worker protective laws under the appearance of productivity and growth. So in India, there are many, many attempts to link this inverse relation between protective legislations and the production, while arguing that laws that increase labor security are not gainful for the worker either. So there are many significant studies which have profoundly, I can share with the team. There are multiple studies which I have referred to, which are talked very highly about in various academic and socio-political domain. And they've profoundly ignored the precariousness and vulnerability question of the worker. There have been claims from the side of state through such, academic and regulatory endeavors too, that reform shall increase the employment percentages. And they have been abnormally silent on the issues of the nature of jobs produced, the wage dynamics, the social security coverage, and leave alone the aspect of collective bargaining power of the worker. We are not even in a position of talking about it. And unfortunately, even that the state has moved into the direction of working on a heavy regulatory endeavor with complete dilution of law and institution and so on, the projected large number of employment generation that was claimed remains a utopia even in present times and in future as well, which the proponents otherwise kept claiming. So wrapping up, cutting the long story short, because one can go on speaking on this, but we also need to historically observe, apart from these 4 labor codes which have come, which have totally been like pro investment and anti-labor, how the traversing of socio-legal standpoints on the labor has taken place in the country. So it's not a very new phenomena. It was happening from a very, very long time. And the way these ideological shift has taken place is also very interesting to observe. From the time of first National Labour Commission, which started in 1966. So it elucidated a blueprint which highly talked about, the workers' collective consciousness and protection fabrics and the strengthening of the court system, the tribunals, etc., putting impetus on protectionism, collectivism, extensive jurisdictions on labor legislations, etc. We also see many of the very important case laws and many important landmark rulings which happen in that era, such as, if I could recall, one is Bharat Bank versus employees of Bharat Bank, and also the very, very famous Bandhua Mukti Morcha case, among many others. But the shift was so rapid from National Commission on Labor 1 to the second National Commission on Labor, which initiated its work in the year 1997 to 1999, where we see the only aim was on the rationalization of the existing legislations and making it more investment friendly. And through the landmark rulings and through the common law traditions, we see that even the courts, even the judiciary had a very, very pro-capitalist language. Some of the case laws which I would like to recall here is, of course, Babu Matthew versus Union of India, and a very important case, which is Balco Employee Union versus Union of India and others, wherein the Supreme Court opined that the courts are not to interfere with the economic policy, which is the function of the expert. It is not the function of the court to sit on the judgment over matters of economic policy, and it must be necessarily left to the expert body. So what we see that the shift has been very rapid, but the shift has been there for a long time. And I think I've already consumed all my time. So just to wind up things, I would just like to say that we also need to see a lot beyond the 4 labor codes, and there are many things which doesn't meet the eye. It's just a tip of an iceberg. So talking about so many things which has, as Vibhuti ma'am has also said, that many states has gone ahead with their flexibilization process, like Gujarat, Haryana, Maharashtra, MP, and many others. I mean, hardly I feel any state is left out. The self-certification schemes for the employers, the changes proposed in the factory laws, the changes in apprentices law, the introduction of fixed term employment to all the sectors. So these are the things which are the complex process of transformation of the projects of labor and employment flexibilization. And this also needs a more redefined and more renewed approach for us as critical thinkers to understand it way beyond the neoliberal lens. It is essential to acknowledge this hybrid process of re-regulation and decentered regulation and neoliberalization through which these changes are proposed. So the underlying fact is that it works in diverse ways, and which extends and sustains it also. So the attempt of the critical theory has to be to work with multiplicity of methods and ideas, and not only to scrutinize, but also to challenge these strategic manifestation of projections, which has great destructive potential against the democratic setup and also the whole idea of the people-centric approach. I had so many things to say, and I yearn to talk on the subjects of where we need to deconstruct strategic manifestation of projected vis-a-vis actual realities, but I leave it at that, and we may just come back for the more on discussion round. And I would like to end my presentation here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would now request Professor Arun to come in for his concluding remarks, followed by a Q&A session.
Given the time shortage, should we take some questions before I make a presentation, or should I make the short, comments and then do the question answer? What would be better? I think we're running out of time, right?
Extend it by 15 minutes as our 15 to 20 minutes, as our next session begins at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
You decide.
Okay, so let me very briefly, what I said in the beginning, I want to extend that, how does the labor consciousness get created? Whether it be women, whether it be unorganized sector, whether it be the middle classes, whether it be other segments, of labor, organized, unorganized, how does it get influenced? How does it get created? Because I think we're struggling. The unorganized sector by definition is unorganized and therefore cannot bargain for its rights. Organized sector doesn't seem to be interested or not able to mobilize and organize, the unorganized sector. And therefore, the weakness of the organized sector keeps manifesting itself. Politically also, the same thing manifests because in the parliament and so on, the pressure is not there to actually formulate policies which are pro-labor. And given the post-1991 phase, which World Bank characterized as market-friendly state intervention. So it's not that the state has withdrawn, but state has acted in favor of the market. That's the way that the World Bank characterized the neoliberal paradigm. And that's what we see, that what I call that this is a phase of marketization. So while markets have always existed, so even barter is a market. Market is a place where you exchange what you need for money that you pay. But marketization means the penetration of the market principles into social institutions. And what marketization has done through the notion of dollar vote, through the notion of more is better, a rational individual maximizing his or her gain, these all have led to the atomization of the individual. We are all profit maximizing individuals who are looking at our individual gain and maximizing that. And feeling guilty is a cost. Therefore, one should not think about what the negative consequences of any action would be. We should only look at how one can improve one's own 1 minute. How one can improve one's own gains. And that atomization that has happened means that we don't look at the collectivity. So collective action has become more and more difficult over a period of time. That is something that we need to take into account. And the second is the consumerism that has entered everybody's life, where we are looking at the gains that we are making by consuming more and more. So I call consumerism as the new opium of the masses. One can involve people into consuming more, the middle classes and so on. So they don't want to lose that. So it's no more a question of workers don't have anything to lose but the chains. The middle classes and the better off segments don't want to participate in any struggles. And that's why creating struggles has become more and more difficult over time. That's why you see the idea of growth with equity that has been jettisoned. Now it is simply you grow the pie and then distribute. And that doesn't happen because trickle down has been very weak since independence. We know that trickle down has become even weaker post 1991, and therefore inequality has increased dramatically post 1991, as various surveys suggest, whether you look at the Oxfam surveys or inequality institution surveys or Credit Suisse surveys and reports that have come. So inequality both in income and wealth has increased dramatically, and yet we keep saying that we have to grow the pie before we actually start distributing or before it trickles down, and that trickle down doesn't happen. So in other words, there are many things like this. One more thing I'd like to point out, which is the invisibilization of the unorganized sector. Our GDP data does not take into account the unorganized sector independently. It uses the organized sector as a proxy for the unorganized sector. And at least since demonetization, the unorganized sector is declining, where the organized sector is rising. And therefore, the rising sector is proxying for the declining sector. So our GDP data is also incorrect. And that's what I would also ask Chirishri to think about, that if the GDP data is incorrect, and especially vis-a-vis the organized sector, then what happens to the wage share in the GDP that she was talking about? And the other thing why GDP data goes wrong is because of the large black economy that we have, and black income generation is largely profit income. It is surplus, part of the surplus. So the share of surplus becomes much higher if you include the black income generation in the economy. So that is something that we also need to take into account in our analysis. And I'd request Dr. Vibhuti Patel to possibly use the term differently able rather than people with disability. I think that's the term that is now being used much more because there's a sensitivity towards people.
But they said the organization of this thing, especially Amita Ghai and all, they say that we want a person with disability. What do you mean by differently able? No? That is the question they have asked. So
I can see that, but I think suppose there's a sensitivity towards people who are characterized as disabled.
Yeah, but they said that marginality has to be acknowledged. That's what their organization
can be, acknowledged in different ways, and perhaps using the term differently able may be a better one. And also, I think to Dr. Patel, I would say, given what she's pointed out, we need to look at the poverty that is getting concentrated in the women. That's something that we, I think, need to also look at. And to Suchi, I would ask, the World Bank has recognized that the neoliberal policies will lead to large number of people becoming poor. And they've been talking since the 80s about the safety net provisions. They're talking because they know that the neoliberal policies will be very unequal. And therefore, to prevent social explosion, safety net devices. And that's why in India from 2005 onward, we had right to education, right to food, etc. But these are not the solutions to the problem. These are only palliatives. The basic problem of why unemployment is increased, why poverty is increased, and I'm saying deliberately that poverty is increased because poverty is defined in terms of space and time. It's a changing line. It's not a fixed line. So when our economists claim that, poverty is declined, I don't agree with them, because you have to keep changing the line. It's a space and time specific. And as we saw in the eShram portal data that has come out, where 27.5 crore people have registered, that 94% say that they're earning less than 10,000 rupees. They may not be below the extreme poverty line that was defined earlier, but they remain poor. So if you think about that, then poverty has got pretty entrenched, and therefore safety net is something that the World Bank was recommending from the 80s itself. And India also went in for that. But since it's not a solution, the World Bank changed its line and started talking about direct benefit transfers from 2014-15 onward. And our chief economic advisor also started talking about it from 2015. Now, the direct benefit transfer is also not a solution, because if you give money in the hand of people when there's a crisis, one can understand. But under normal circumstances, if you make that permanent, then it's work which gives dignity. So if you don't have work and you're simply getting money in hand, dignity would not be there, and there'd be greater alienation in society. So one could think about that also. So these are some of the points I wanted to make about how consciousness of the workers, different segments of the workers, how that comes about, and how mobilization of labor, which is very important if we are to resist these trends that are visible in society. If that is to happen, then we have to mobilize the unorganized sector. But how is that to happen? That's something that I think people who are working on theory need to give answers for. Thank you very much.
Would you like to take some questions, Professor Kumar?
Yeah, I think, that's what was announced, that we'll have questions now.
Professor Varveer Arora has raised his hand.
Yeah.
And it was difficulty entering.
Yes, thank you, Savita, for enabling my entrance. I was keen to listen to this debate, and notably my friend Arun, who always has very stimulating ideas. Now, I would put forward a couple of points which I think in the evolving scenario, we need to perhaps study a little more. One is that statistics seem to show that women are falling off the workforce at an alarming rate. The reasons for that are many. Rampant unemployment, therefore the men move to work, they are relegated. Rising inequality, therefore they are married off earlier and confined to the household. There are so many things, I don't need to spell them out. I'm only talking about the fact that this trend needs to be studied, and also in the process we think of how it can be reversed. It's a very alarming thing. The second point that I wanted to know whether there has been reflection on that is the impact, A, of contractualization, and B, of the new modes of functioning, the work from home, the online, which concern, I admit, only a small number of professions. But I think there is some impact already on the bargaining power of those who work. And this bargaining power, Arun mentioned that mobilization has become difficult. This debate, I recall in other parts of the world, in Europe in the 50s and 60s, that the working class is disappearing, it's becoming bourgeois. And with that, its appetite for struggle is diminishing. I think it is a false debate, because what Europe found is that the working class has not disappeared. its members have changed. There are more migrants. There are more new entrants. And of course, you are covering many of these with your unorganized sector, which is again a problem in many economies. These categories of labor tend to be unorganized. Either they don't have the proper papers or they don't have the proper backing. The fact that political parties have thrown up their hands at mobilizing the working class as a working class is something that deserves to be noted. Political parties do a lot of mobilization on various issues, but that specific appeal to labor, to the working class, there are benefits. Yes, there are a lot of promises that are, but they are so I conclude that the fact that they are not being mobilized is perhaps due to the fact that there is no effort to mobilize them. That is what I wanted to say. That it is not that they have become bourgeois and middle class and have too much at stake and are not willing to. We see this in many countries. If something comes up, they do get mobilized. That's a couple of points which were inspired by part of what I heard from you. I joined late, and of course, Arun's reflections. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think let's take some questions and then maybe the panelists. Yes, Savita wants to ask.
So first of all, I must say that this has been an extraordinary session. There are so many new things that we have learned. All three presentations were very, very good. Let me start with Chirashri's presentation, because it gives us a picture quite gloomy and disheartening. And the picture is one of cheapening labor. Now, I want to understand from an economist like you and others as to what is the threshold, because Chirashri ended with saying that it can collapse, the economy can collapse, cheapen the labor beyond a point. So I want to understand it in economic and political terms. Vibhuti Patel, in her presentation, literally took off from there by showing that the impact of cheapening of labor is actually devastating women of this country. And Professor Arora also pointed out that the implication for whatever is happening in neoliberalism, women are facing the brunt of it. I mean, the unemployment affects women first. Marriage affects, entrenches their inequality in patriarchal system in such a way that they just simply cannot get out of it. Jobs are not there for them to find, and so the home, the household labor is their destiny, which is unpaid. So the third paper was also dealing with how things are being regulated. I want to understand where, and third point that I wanted to make, Professor Arora's point, that is it the strategy is not being taught, Professor Arora, because of the changing nature of the labor force in Europe, mainly non-European. Is there a racism of the sort that is invisible in not organizing this, allowing them to cheap labor forever, that economy? So these are some of the points that I had in mind, but mainly I want to understand this phenomenon of cheapening of labor in India and its political and social implications for the general population and women in particular.
Okay, other questions? Yes, Akhil.
Thank you, sir. My question is regarding the identity politics and the labor class or working class. If we look at from the perspective of India's Northeast, or for that matter, the country as a whole, now the identity politics has become, or ethnic identities have become the main rallying points of the political mobilization. Bolvi Arurasa has talked about it, why the political parties have failed or political parties have refused to mobilize the working class towards the attainment of their rights. If we see it from the perspective of Northeast India, for example, when identity has become the rallying point of political mobilization, not only of the Hindutva forces, but all ethnic groups which have, occupied the center stage in electoral politics. For them, the labor class or working class, who is mostly constituted by the migrants, are the outs. They fall outside the overall jurisdiction of their political mobilization. So how do you look at it, means identity politics and the working class, or do you have a resolution to it? I'm just mentioning it because if you look at the social movements in the country as a whole, also from the perspective of India's Northeast, there were some mobilization from 2005-6 onward up to 2014. There had been some mobilizations, the rallying points had been the universal concerns, for example, labor rights, for that matter, food, employment, and so on and so forth. But from 2014, we have again seen that that process has been reversed. So under this context, what kind of future we look for, or what kind of strategies that we have been devising towards that attainment of rights by the working class? Thank you, sir.
So I think we've had a series of questions. Now, given the time constraint, I think the panelists can answer one by one. And maybe we can reverse the order. So Suchi can go first, then Dr. Patel, and then Chirashri. Suchi, would you like to make your final points on the questions that are raised?
Yeah, so the final points to the questions, I think there were not many questions raised particularly to me, but I absolutely agree with what you have said, that the direct benefit transfer and the World Bank stand, the wavering stand, has sort of definitely led to the policy crisis in countries like India, which we witness. And I would like to also invoke what is happening in the 4 labor codes, and primarily the labor code on social security, which is very, very problematic, is the whole aspect of taxing the labor. So the recognition of the unorganized sector or informal sector, so to say, as the nomenclature goes in terms of the social security legislation. So what they have done is that they have, as I have already mentioned, that they have recognized each and every kind of work in, say, the gig work, the on-call, the temporary work, and so on. But at the same time, the social security fabric, the model for that is very, very clearly the taxing of the labor himself. So the worker, say the own account worker, for example, the one, say, who's putting a ready at a colony's gate, or a chaat wala or a chai wala, so on. So he or she will have to pay his part along with his or her part, along with the part which is to be paid from the side of the employer. So these are the new trends which has started coming, and this again, I think I really need to understand from you from where this kind of model comes, wherein the taxing of the worker within the unorganized or an informal sector has taken place, and the whole fabric of the social security has taken a new form altogether, wherein everything is present, every aspect is present, which is not in the favor of labor, but in the favor of the capital. The second thing which I wanted to mention in this point also was the role of intermediary agencies in all the legislation. So I primarily talk more from the legislation perspective, and the points which totally make me very, very unsettled, very, very underconfident about what is going to happen in the world of work, what is the future of work, is the role of intermediary agencies. So the intermediary agencies, what these legislation talk, would be the private players again, who would be dealing with all the requirements of, say, social security, or the requirements wherein the social protection schemes of the workers come in forth. So these are the things which I don't know. I think I need to know more from you. Is there a push from an international governance structure, or is it a more indigenous format which has come, which is absolutely anti-people and which is pushing the vulnerable, precarious, informal class worker into more and more deepened precarity? So that is my point, which I wanted to add on. And along with that, of course, the feminization of work and invisibility of women at work is again another concern which we really need to look at, that the new form of the labor legislations and the regulatory governance totally does away with the whole understanding of women who is also a participant in the labor force. So it is primarily, as it has been already said with by the other speakers, it is primarily the male body, which is the prominent partner of the labor, prominent participant of the labor force, and the aspects related to, say, feminization, invisibility of work, invisible caregiving, etc., is totally done away with till now. So with this, I think I'll hand over to the other speaker.
Yeah, I think Dr. Vibhuti Patel can now. If we can keep our answers brief, because I think we've already gone 20 minutes over. So let's keep very brief answers.
The first one is about identity politics. I think it's true that politicians are mobilizing, but they are mobilizing them on the ground of ethnicity, religion, or racism. And it percolates down to the work culture also, where in multinational company like Larsen and Toubro, workers were demanding separate canteen for Hindus and non-Hindus, or even separate drinking place for Hindus. So it goes down to that level, no? So I think second one is argument about atomization. I think that we have seen in several studies of my students of gig workers, where they can't communicate with client, they should not communicate with the co-workers, they can't form a WhatsApp group. That's what has emerged. So complete atomization and everything. The moment they are locked out of the system, they are unemployed. They don't even know who their employer is. No, so that. And again, I would reiterate my point about person with disability, because whenever I used to use differently abled, I was challenged by the people with disability. They said, you write either visually challenged or impaired or hearing, because we have a Center for Disability Studies in TISS. There also, the professors themselves have a various types of, they are differently able, but there is a big controversy. It is still an unresolved issue, work in progress. Thank you.
Okay. Chirishri? Hello?
Yes, please, just a second. So I actually have quite a few things to respond to, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I'll kind of connect everything and try to bring it together. So I completely agree with Professor Arun Kumar's comment to me about the derived form of the estimates of GDP, which essentially sort of doesn't really do justice to the value created, the estimations of value created in the informal economy and the mode through which it is distributed. However, there's now work on the informal sector and the informal economy, and especially I would like to, and informal labor especially, both from a theoretical as well as political economy perspective, which, for example, the work of Shataki Roy, which essentially has shown that the wage surplus relationship and the modes of extraction are even more intensified in the informal sector because of the different types of deployment of labor. And I'll just give example of two. One is, of course, like, for example, self-exploitation of people who are like what people are talking about, street vendors, etc. But also, like, this question of unpaid labor in terms of multitasking, which is seen often in the case of home-based workers. Now, which actually then connects to, and I'll come back to the point about Black economy later, to Professor Balveer Arora's point about work from home. And I want to bring in a class angle here, in the sense that this idea of work from home is something that has evolved in terms of more middle class informal and formal. For example, people like us have also been reduced to work from home. But home-based work has been like, especially for women workers, has been like a very important, as Professor Patel pointed out, a very important part of the way in which women are mobilized deployed in the labor force. And hence while the questions in terms of how to mobilize will differ depending on the level of isolation, etc. But what we do see is that there are unions of home-based workers, not like, it's not as big, of course. And we've also seen similarly mobilizations of ASHA workers, street vendors through formation of unions, even though, and they've had a hard time fighting. Domestic workers, first legislation in favor of domestic workers had to be brought in by Maharashtra in the 1990s. And similarly, there are also now unions of platform workers. For example, Swiggy workers have formed unions in Kolkata. There are these IT workers are unionizing now in both Bangalore as well as Kolkata. And so I don't think that in terms of the organization while there's been it has been difficult, it's not like there is nothing. However, the point that I want to connect to my original presentation is that when there was a conception, when the balance of class forces was such that trade unions were powerful, and these were organized trade unions, that was when the universal conception of workers' rights was adopted by the state in 1947. And with the increase of the intervention, the institutional intervention in 1956 of informalization, what has happened is that only a small section of workers were entitled to not universal but statutory workers' rights, while all others have had to fight their battles to get whatever they can. And often they've been made to fight against each other. And often identity politics becomes a brilliant tool to rather make people fight against each other than to fight against state and capital. Which is like one response to the question about the link between identity politics and organization. And then like I go back to the question of the Black economy, because I think the very point that you made, that means that actually whatever I'm showing is an underestimate and the share of the surplus is even more. However, from the point of value creation in terms of what is operating, because the Black economy is like appropriation of value. It is not actually creating value in that sense. I don't know if you'll agree with me. In that sense, the value creating sectors of the economy from which the Black economy siphons off money is something that is pure profit. But despite that, the profit rate in the value creating sector is falling. Okay. So that in that sense, and this is from the ASI data, which is also organized sector data, which actually shows then, and we've seen this post-pandemic and even before the crisis of small micro businesses, etc. And rising unemployment is another indicator which really shows this crisis of capital. And this I will end with the answer to Savita, because I think that is the crux. And it also relates to Professor Balveer Arora's other point about this thing about the racism. So this thing that I talked about, the graded hierarchy that we have socially, has been effectively mobilized both in the pre and post-independence period through non-intervention. Atrocities are criminalized, untouchability is criminalized, but the caste system is not criminalized. Religious discrimination to a certain extent is criminalized, but othering and separation, segregation, etc. is not really criminalized. All of this means a tacit kind of allowing of a social structure that helps to basically keep social reproduction very cheap. So the cost of reproducing a worker can be cheapened and cheapened using this mode of extraction of unpaid labor within paid labor. And this in itself is something that has kept the labor cheapening process going. So the start has to be from the realm of social reproduction, relating to what Professor Patel has been saying. And essentially that is from where, and the way in which this is done is through, as was pointed out earlier, that people who are precarious, who are vulnerable, and if there are not precarious already, through deployment of religion and through deployment of different kinds of modes of violence, you make them precarious. Okay? And dispossess them. And so all of this together leads to the continuation of labor cheapening, very similar to what has happened, for example, in the UK. Post-Thatcher, the white working class was completely demobilized, and there was no reskilling, no re-employment after the factories shut down. And there is enough work to show that what emerged was social alcoholism and domestic abuse. And a new generation of workers with a different set of skills were brought in, with selective policies of migration, and which created a graded hierarchy based on pure racism. Okay? And something similar in terms of not race really, but on the basis of caste, religion, and patriarchy is what is being perpetuated here in terms of labor cheapening. And while I might have sounded very negative, but in terms of the political implication, what I'm trying to say is that the silos in which the citizenship rights and labor rights, the movements for citizenship rights and labor rights work, that silo needs to be broken. And it is only then that that rupture that I talked about in terms of connecting, to be able to break the cycle of labor cheapening can happen. If it doesn't happen, this labor cheapening can be perpetuated endlessly by bringing in newer and newer categories of people who will be made more and more precarious on the basis of the social re-engineering and social division. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Chirishri, for that explanation. But let me also add, we can discuss it later, that actually, there is output that is missed out of GDP. So there is value creation because of Black income generation that's outside the GDP through under-invoicing and over-invoicing, both in external trade as well as within the economy. So we can discuss this a little later. But I'll add, that even people like Warren Buffett have been saying since 2012 that the rich needs to pay more taxes. He gave the example that his secretary, who earned $100,000, pays a higher tax rate than he did, whereas his income was $3 billion. So I think, many rich capitalists in the US supported him, in Germany, Italy, France, and so on, because they recognize that the kind of inequality that is getting created is creating problem for demand in the economy. So the point that you're making about demand, that I think is being recognized quite widely in the capitalist system itself. And the World Bank saying that we need to go for DBT, the direct benefit transfer, also implies that we don't want full employment. We cannot achieve full employment through the mechanisms that are already there. And that's why we need to find an alternate route. Otherwise, one of the principles of capitalism is that you pay for the work that is done. You don't pay for work that is not done. So here, direct benefit transfer means that we simply transfer funds to the people who don't have employment, which is against the basic tenets of capitalism. So the World Bank itself recognizes that there is a crisis that is brewing. They're looking for solutions. First, they thought of the safety net devices for the poor, and then they now think of the direct benefit transfer, because even the safety net devices are inadequate to take care of what's happening to the poor people. And I think this is what's happened politically also in India since 1991, that all political parties have accepted that there is TINA. There is no alternative but to go in for these policies. So whichever has come, whether it was the Congress and the United Front and then the BJP, then the UPA and NDA, they've all accepted this idea of TINA, that there is no alternative. And that I think characterizes the world as a whole. Think about the Arab Spring movement that suddenly erupted, And then after a few years, now situation is much worse than what it was earlier. The Occupy Wall Street, erupted for a year and then died down. So I think the need for an alternative, thinking, and that's where, when I was saying atomization not just of the individual, but a whole class of people. They think that we need to look only at our own benefit rather than look at the social benefit. So this atomization process, which is undermining collective action, needs to be looked at a wider sense. And I think political parties sense that. And that's why the political parties are not mobilizing. The point that Professor Arora is making, that they can mobilize, but they're not mobilizing. And they're not mobilizing because they think that there's no purchase there. Otherwise, 94% of the workforce is unorganized sector. If you could mobilize them, you could win elections. But I think all the political parties accept that that's not possible. That they're in favor of the current system and so on. So, these are things that we can continue with over a long period of time. They're not going to be settled soon or immediately. So thanks a lot to the speakers. Thanks a lot to the participants. I hand it over to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to thank the chair as well as the speakers for their insightful remarks and extensive presentations. We now have a break and we'll be joining back at 3 o'clock. I do request all of you, if you do find time, to join us back in the session at 3. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, bye.
Bye. Love this.
Thank you.
Another great session that was.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you all. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty. It's good to see you.
Oh yeah.
You spoke with your.
We will discuss the concept of cheapening. I think all three of you, all four of you, made a lot of contribution to taking creative theory forward with new concepts, new challenges.
Yes.
Great. That was a great session.
Shuchi, madam, where are you, Dr. Shuchi?
Ma'am, I work with the Asian Law College. I'm Chirashri ma'am's student.
Aha, you are in Delhi.
Yes.
Nice meeting. Made so many new friends.
Absolutely. And I've been following your work from the very beginning, from my student days.
Yeah. No, but yours was really very refreshing. Both of you, you and Chirashri madam, both of you. Hi, Professor.
Vibhuti,
yeah.
Vibhuti, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
That was a great presentation as always.
Correct. Yeah.
And Shuchi, you have to now.
Suruchi is a discovery. I'm hearing her for the first time.
Yeah, Shuchi is really, I heard of her. Very, very refreshing perspective.
Excellent. Thank you. That was very, very.
He's also author of the first book published by Themes in Creative Theory series, in the series.
Oh, really? Oh, great.
That's on CSR, corporate.
Oh, that is the one. I see. I haven't seen the book. So
come very soon. Indian edition is yet to come, and Palgrave is very costly. It is around.
Palgrave is very costly.
9,000 rupees.
Yeah.
But have you circulated its contents
PDF.
and I think we should circulate that.
We will do that. So she's also running for a kind of discussion series on labor.
Oh, very good. Very good.
So the first one is with Professor Arun Kumar himself, and I can share the link with that. It's a very elaborate session on labor and mass exodus, which happened during the first wave.
Oh, very good. Yeah. Because, labor studies haven't entered the core of social sciences. Unfortunately, they are still add-ons.
Our book is also out, but it is also again 11,000 rupees. But we luckily after 1 month of fighting, we got the PDF, so I can share with friends. And
great. So I was really looking at the chapters, and the book is.
Yeah. No, I can share it. Yeah. If I have your email ID, I can share the. Yeah.
We have an Indian publisher. We have collaboration with the Indian publisher. Within a week's time, it will come. It's already.
Yeah. That will be good.
So it is on the law and regulatory deconstruction of how this legitimization in the governance the corporate sector gets through the whole idea of CSR being great for the welfare of the country and so on, this kind of rhetoric being created. That's what I have attempted. I would.
But still 85% CSR funds are unutilized.
Yeah.